Please, don't take my child away. The desperate scream tore through Dustridge's marketplace like a knife through silk. A mother on her knees. A child's hands being pried away. A debt collector's cold smile. This is the story of how one silent man's courage changed everything. Stay with me until the very end of this tale, and comment below with your city name so I can see how far this story travels across the world. Now, let me take you back to Wyoming, 1887. The dust of Dustridge, Wyoming had a particular quality in the autumn of 1887. It hung in the air like guilt, settling on everything it touched, coating the wooden storefronts and the consciences of good people who had learned long ago that sometimes survival meant looking away. The marketplace sprawled across the town square every Saturday morning, a chaotic symphony of shouting vendors, bleating livestock, and the metallic ring of horseshoes against packed earth. It was a place where fortunes changed hands, where the desperate sold what little they had, and where the wealthy came to remind everyone else of their place in the world's cruel hierarchy. Lydia Harrow knew that hierarchy intimately. She had lived at its bottom for 3 years now, ever since influenza had stolen her husband Samuel during the brutal winter of 1884, leaving her with a 4-year-old daughter, a mountain of debt, and hands that, no matter how hard they worked, could never seem to earn enough to climb out of the hole that widened beneath her feet with each passing month. She stood now at the edge of the marketplace, her dress patched in so many places that the original fabric was barely visible beneath the repairs, her hands raw and reddened from taking in washing for the town's more fortunate families. Annie clung to her skirt, the child's face smudged with dirt, her blonde hair tangled despite Lydia's best efforts each morning to make her daughter presentable. The girl clutched a corn-husk doll that Lydia had fashioned from scraps, the only toy Annie had known for over a year. "Mama, I'm hungry," Annie whispered, tugging at Lydia's sleeve. Lydia's heart cracked a little more, the way it did every time her daughter spoke those words. "I know, sweetheart, just a little longer. Mama needs to talk to Mr. Clay about the money you owe me." The voice cut through the marketplace noise like a blade through butter. Barrett Clay emerged from the crowd, his expensive suit immaculate despite the dust that plagued everyone else, his silver-topped cane tapping against the ground with each step. He was a man who had made his considerable fortune by understanding one fundamental truth. Desperation made people predictable, and predictable people could be controlled. Lydia's spine straightened instinctively, even as fear coiled in her stomach. "Mr. Clay, I came to discuss an extension on—" "An extension?" Barrett's laugh was cold, calculated to carry across the square. Already, heads were turning. Already, the show was beginning. "Mrs. Harrow, we've had this conversation 3 times now. Each time, you promise payment. Each time, you fail to deliver. I'm a businessman, not a charity." "Please." Lydia hated the sound of her own voice, hated the pleading quality that crept into it. "Just 2 more weeks. Mrs. Henderson said she'd pay me extra for—" "Mrs. Henderson told me yesterday she's found cheaper help." Barrett stepped closer, and Lydia caught the scent of his cologne, something expensive and foreign that seemed to mock her poverty. "Face facts, woman. You're 3 months behind on your rent. You owe me $47, and you have no means of paying it." $47. It might as well have been $4,000. Lydia had 12 cents in her pocket and a sack of cornmeal at home that would last maybe another week if she stretched it thin enough. "I'll find a way," she said. But even she didn't believe the words. Barrett's smile widened. He'd been waiting for this moment, she realized. Planning it. "I'm sure you will. In fact, I've come prepared with a solution." He snapped his fingers, and 2 men materialized from the crowd. Lydia recognized them. Travis Boone and Frank Miller, hired muscle who did Barrett's dirty work. They moved with the casual brutality of men who had stopped seeing other people as human beings long ago. "What are you doing?" Lydia's voice rose as Travis grabbed her arm. "Let go of me." "You can't pay your debt with money," Barrett announced, his voice projecting across the square where a crowd was rapidly gathering. "So you'll pay it with labor. 3 years of service in my household should settle accounts. Your daughter will be placed with a family in Denver who needs—" "No!" The word exploded from Lydia's throat. She yanked her arm free from Travis, stumbling backward and pulling Annie behind her. "You can't take my child. She's all I have." She's collateral, Barrett corrected, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. And technically, according to the contract you signed when you borrowed money for your husband's burial, I have every legal right to... She's 4 years old! Lydia's scream silenced the marketplace. Vendors stopped hawking their wares. Horses stamped nervously. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She's a child, not property. Barrett's expression didn't change. He nodded to Frank, who moved toward Annie with mechanical precision. What happened next would be seared into Lydia's memory forever. She dropped to her knees in the dirt, her hands clasped in front of her as tears carved clean tracks through the dust on her face. Pride, dignity, self-respect, all of it evaporated in the face of a mother's terror. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Please, don't take my child away. I'll do anything. I'll work day and night. I'll find the money somehow. Just don't take her. She's all I have. She's everything." Annie was crying now, clutching her mother's neck with desperate strength. "Mama! Mama!" Frank's hand closed around Annie's arm. "No, no, please! Please!" The crowd watched. Some looked uncomfortable. A few women dabbed at their eyes. But no one moved. No one spoke. This was the way of things in Dustridge. Barrett Clay owned half the town, held mortgages on most of the rest, and crossing him meant losing everything you had. Better to look away. Better to pretend you didn't see. Travis produced a length of rope from his belt. "For God's sake," Lydia sobbed. "She's just a baby. Please, I'm begging you." "Ma'am, if you resist, we'll have to restrain you," Travis said, not unkindly. He probably had children of his own at home. Probably told himself he was just doing his job. Probably slept just fine at night. The rope bit into Lydia's wrists as they bound her hands behind her back. Annie's screams intensified as Frank lifted her, the little girl's legs kicking wildly, her cornhusk doll falling forgotten into the dirt. "Mama! I want my mama!" Annie baby, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Barrett dusted off his sleeves, satisfied. "Take the child to the station. There's a train to Denver at 3 o'clock. Mrs. Harrow, you'll report to my estate tomorrow morning at dawn to begin—" "Stop!" The word wasn't shouted. It wasn't loud. But somehow it cut through Annie's screams, through Lydia's sobs, through the murmur of the crowd. It carried a weight that made people turn, made Barrett's self-satisfied expression flicker with something that might have been uncertainty. At the edge of the square where the marketplace met the open prairie stood a man. Lydia had seen him before. Everyone in Dustridge had. He came to town once a month for supplies, never spoke more than necessary, paid in cash, and left. Some called him Caleb Rowan. Others just called him the Quiet One. He owned a ranch somewhere in the hills north of town, ran cattle, kept to himself. There were rumors, of course. There were always rumors about men who chose solitude. Some said he was running from something. Others said he'd lost his family in some tragedy and couldn't bear to be around people anymore. A few claimed he simply preferred the company of horses and cattle to human beings. He was tall, Lydia noticed through her tears. Probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a weathered face that suggested a life spent outdoors. His clothes were simple, worn denim, a faded shirt, a hat that had seen better days. But there was something about the way he stood, something in his bearing that commanded attention, despite his ordinary appearance. He walked forward, his boots making soft thuds against the packed earth. The crowd parted automatically, instinctively, the way people move aside for something dangerous or unpredictable. Barrett's jaw tightened. "This doesn't concern you, Rowan." Caleb didn't respond. He kept walking, his eyes fixed on Frank, who still held the struggling Annie. When he reached them, he stopped, standing perhaps 3 feet away. His hand moved to his belt, and for a moment Lydia thought he might draw a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a small leather pouch. The silence that followed was profound. Caleb opened the pouch and poured its contents into his palm. Gold coins. Not many, but enough. He walked to Barrett and dropped the coins at the man's feet. They clinked against each other, glinting in the autumn sunlight. The sound of freedom, of salvation, of a debt paid in full. Barrett stared at the coins, then at Caleb. "You're joking." Caleb's expression didn't change. He gestured toward Lydia, then toward Annie, then back to the coins. The message was clear even without words. Take the money. Let them go. This is insane, Barrett said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. She owes me service. There's a contract. You can't just... Caleb took one step forward. Just one. But something in that movement, something in his eyes, made Barrett take 2 steps back. Fine, Barrett snapped, his face flushing red. Fine. Take her. Take the brat. But don't think this makes you some kind of hero, Rowan. You just bought yourself a widow and a child. I hope you know what you're doing with them. He paused, his smile returning, ugly and insinuating. Or maybe you do. Maybe that's exactly what you wanted. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Several men in the crowd chuckled. Lydia felt her face burn with humiliation on top of everything else. Caleb ignored them all. He walked to Travis, held out his hand. Travis glanced at Barrett, who waved him away irritably. Travis untied Lydia's wrists. The rope fell away and Lydia gasped, rubbing at the raw skin. Then Caleb was crouching in front of her, his eyes level with hers. Up close she could see they were gray, the color of storm clouds over the prairie. He held out his hand, not grabbing, not demanding, just offering. Lydia stared at that hand. She'd learned to distrust kindness. Kindness always had a price, and she had nothing left to pay with. But Annie was still crying in Frank's arms, and the alternative was watching her daughter be put on a train to Denver, and so she placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle as he helped her to her feet. Then he turned to Frank. "Give her the child," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, rusty from disuse, but absolutely certain. Frank looked at Barrett. Barrett made a disgusted gesture. Frank set Annie down and the girl immediately ran to her mother, wrapping herself around Lydia's legs with a grip that suggested she would never let go again. Caleb picked up Annie's fallen doll from the dirt, brushed it off, and handed it to the little girl. She took it with wide, tear-streaked eyes, staring at him as if he'd descended from heaven itself. Then, without another word, Caleb turned and walked toward a horse and wagon waiting at the edge of the square. He climbed into the driver's seat and looked back at Lydia, waiting. "Go on," someone in the crowd muttered, before Clay changes his mind. Lydia's legs moved automatically, carrying her and Annie toward the wagon. Someone, she never saw who, helped her climb up. She settled onto the rough wooden seat, Annie in her lap, and looked at the man beside her. The man who had just paid $47 for strangers. The man who had stood up to Barrett Clay when no one else would. "Why?" she whispered. Caleb didn't answer. He just flicked the reins, and the horse began to move, pulling them away from the marketplace, away from Barrett Clay's fury and the crowd's judgmental stares, away from Dustridge and everything Lydia had known for 3 terrible years. She looked back once. Barrett stood in the middle of the square, surrounded by the coins Caleb had thrown at his feet, his face twisted with rage. Their eyes met across the distance, and Lydia saw the promise in his expression. This isn't over. Then the wagon turned a corner, and he was gone. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, golden grass bending in waves beneath the wind. Annie had cried herself to sleep against Lydia's chest, exhausted by terror and relief in equal measure. Lydia held her daughter and tried to make sense of what had just happened. "I don't have any money," she finally said. The words felt necessary, like setting terms before things went any further. "Whatever you paid for me, I can't pay you back. I can work. I'm a hard worker. But if you think..." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice what Barrett's parting words had implied, what the crowd's laughter had suggested, what she'd seen in the eyes of too many men over the past 3 years. A widow alone was vulnerable. A widow alone with a child was desperate. Desperation made people agreeable to all sorts of arrangements. Caleb glanced at her briefly, then back at the road. He said nothing. "I need to know what you expect from me," Lydia pressed, hating how her voice shook. "I need to know what this is." For a long moment, the only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the distant cry of a hawk overhead. Then Caleb spoke, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "Expect you to be safe." 3 words. That was all. But something in Lydia's chest loosened slightly. "And after that?" she asked. "What happens after that?" Caleb was silent again, his eyes on the horizon, where the land met the sky in a perfect line. Finally he said, Don't know yet. It wasn't much of an answer. It should have terrified her. Instead, strangely, it gave her the first real hope she'd felt in months. Because don't know yet wasn't a plan. It wasn't a scheme. It wasn't a man who had already decided what she was worth and what he could take from her. It was just honest uncertainty, and somehow that was better than any promise could have been. They traveled for nearly 3 hours. The sun climbed higher, then began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the grass in shades of amber and gold. Annie woke once, looked around with confused eyes, then burrowed back against Lydia and fell asleep again. Lydia watched the landscape change. The flat prairie gradually gave way to rolling hills, then to steeper terrain dotted with pine trees and outcroppings of gray rock. They followed a creek for a while, the water running clear and cold, then climbed into higher country where the air grew cooler and the sky somehow seemed bigger. Finally, as the sun touched the mountains in the distance, Caleb guided the wagon through a narrow pass between 2 hills, and suddenly there it was. The ranch wasn't much to look at. A single-story house built of rough-hewn logs, its roof missing shingles in places, its porch sagging slightly on one side. A barn that had seen better days, its red paint faded to pink in places, weathered to bare wood in others. A corral with fence posts that tilted at odd angles. A chicken coop. A small vegetable garden that looked like it had been neglected for weeks. But beyond the buildings, the land itself was beautiful. A valley stretched out, protected by hills on 3 sides, with the creek they'd been following running through its center. Cattle grazed in the distance, perhaps 40 or 50 head. The grass was thick and green despite the season. And the silence, Lydia had never experienced silence like this. In town, there was always noise, always voices, always wagon wheels, always something. Here, there was just the wind and the water and the occasional low of a cow. Caleb pulled the wagon up in front of the house and climbed down. He held up his hand to help Lydia descend, then waited while she woke Annie. "Is this heaven?" Annie asked sleepily, looking around with wide eyes. "No, baby," Lydia said. It's Mr. Roan's home." "Caleb," he said quietly. It was the first time he'd told them his given name. He led them inside. The house was sparse but clean, cleaner than Lydia had expected for a man living alone. One large room served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. 2 doors led to what she assumed were bedrooms. The furniture was simple: a table with 4 chairs, a worn sofa, a rocking chair by the fire. No decorations on the walls. No photographs. No personal touches that might tell her anything about the man who lived here. Caleb gestured to one of the bedroom doors. "Yours," he said simply. Lydia opened it cautiously. Inside was a bed, an actual bed, not a straw mattress on the floor like she'd been sleeping on in Dustridge, with a patchwork quilt, a dresser, a small window looking out over the valley. It was more than she'd had in 3 years. "I can't," she said automatically. "This is too much. I should sleep in the barn, or—" "Yours," Caleb repeated, his tone suggesting the matter wasn't up for discussion. "Then where will you sleep?" He gestured toward the other bedroom door, then seemed to reconsider. "Barn's fine." "Absolutely not." The words came out more forcefully than Lydia intended. She might be desperate, she might be in this man's debt, but she wasn't going to let him sleep in his own barn while she took his bed. "You've done more than enough. We'll figure out something else." For the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered across Caleb's face. He walked to the fireplace, knelt down, and began building a fire with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, flames were crackling, pushing warmth into the room. "Hungry?" he asked. Lydia's stomach answered before she could, growling loudly enough that Annie giggled. Caleb stood and moved to the kitchen area, pulling items from shelves and a root cellar. Potatoes, onions, a slab of salt pork, flour, lard. "I can do that," Lydia said quickly, moving forward. "Please, let me. You've already done so much." Caleb stepped aside without argument, watching as she located a knife, a cutting board, a pan. Her hands knew what to do. They'd prepared thousands of meals over the years, first for Samuel, then for herself and Annie, then for the families whose washing she took in, who sometimes paid her in food instead of coin. She worked in silence, aware of Caleb's presence but not uncomfortable with it. He wasn't watching her the way some men did, with eyes that lingered and calculated. He was just present. He fed more wood to the fire, then sat in the rocking chair with a piece of leather and some tools, working on what looked like a bridle repair. Annie, her initial shyness overcome by exhaustion and hunger, wandered over to him. She stood about 3 feet away, staring with unabashed curiosity. "Why don't you talk?" she asked, with the directness of children everywhere. "Annie!" Lydia spun around, mortified. "That's rude. Apologize right now." But Caleb didn't look offended. He glanced at Annie, seemed to consider the question, then shrugged slightly. "Nothing much to say." "Mama talks all the time," Annie informed him. "Sometimes she talks even when nobody's there. She says it's because she's thinking out loud." Despite everything, the terror of the day, the uncertainty of their situation, Lydia felt a smile tug at her lips. "I like quiet," Annie continued. "Mr. Barrett talked too much. He had a mean voice." At the mention of Barrett's name, Caleb's hands stilled on the leather. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You don't have a mean voice," Annie decided. "You have a quiet voice. That's better." She plopped down on the floor near his chair, content to watch him work. After a moment, Caleb resumed his repairs, and they sat in companionable silence while Lydia cooked. Dinner was simple: fried salt pork with potatoes and onions, biscuits that weren't as good as she'd wanted but were edible, but it was more food than Lydia and Annie had seen in weeks. They ate at the table, Annie swinging her legs and chattering between bites about everything and nothing, Lydia eating slowly and watching Caleb from the corner of her eye. He ate methodically, without much attention to the food, as if eating were just another necessary task. But when Annie asked if she could have another biscuit, and Lydia hesitated, worried about taking too much, he pushed the entire basket toward the little girl without a word. After dinner, while Lydia washed the dishes in a basin, there was a pump right in the kitchen, an incredible luxury. Annie's eyelids began to droop. The day's trauma was catching up with her. "Bedtime, sweetheart," Lydia said gently. "Will you tell me a story?" Annie asked, then turned to Caleb. "Will Mr. Quiet tell me a story?" "Mr. Quiet?" Lydia repeated, confused. Annie pointed at Caleb. "That's his name, because he's quiet, like a mouse." Lydia expected Caleb to correct her, to insist on his proper name, but he just nodded slightly, accepting the moniker. I don't think Caleb tells stories," Lydia said. "That's okay," Annie yawned. "Mama tells good stories. But maybe Mr. Quiet could listen?" Lydia looked at Caleb, expecting him to refuse, to want his evening to himself after the chaos of the day. But he stood, setting aside his leather work, and followed them into the bedroom. Annie climbed into the bed, the big soft bed that was like something from a dream, and Lydia sat beside her, smoothing her daughter's tangled hair. Caleb stood in the doorway, neither in nor out, just present. "Once upon a time," Lydia began, falling into the familiar rhythm of the fairy tales she'd told Annie 1,000 times, "there was a princess who lived in a tall tower." As she spoke, weaving a tale of magic and adventure, of dragons defeated and true love found, she was aware of Caleb listening. His face remained impassive, but his eyes, those storm-gray eyes, were fixed on Annie with an expression Lydia couldn't quite read. Sadness? Longing? Memory? By the time the princess and her prince lived happily ever after, Annie was asleep, her corn-husk doll clutched in one hand, her other hand reaching out to hold Lydia's fingers. Lydia stood carefully, trying not to wake her, and turned to find Caleb had vanished as silently as he'd arrived. She covered Annie with the quilt, kissed her forehead, and stood for a long moment looking at her daughter's peaceful face. Safe. For the first time in 3 years, Annie was truly safe. When Lydia emerged from the bedroom, she found Caleb laying out blankets on the sofa. "You're not sleeping in the barn," she said firmly. He looked at her, one eyebrow raised slightly. "The sofa's not big enough for you," she continued. "You'll hurt your back. And this is your home. We're the intruders." "Not intruders." "Then what are we?" The question came out more desperate than she intended. "I need to understand. What is this arrangement? What do you want from us? Caleb sat down on the sofa, his hands clasped between his knees. For a long time he was silent, and Lydia thought he might not answer at all. Then, finally, he spoke. Had a family once. Wife. Baby girl. Lydia's breath caught, past tense. Had. Fever took them. 4 years ago. I'm so sorry, Lydia whispered. Caleb shrugged slightly, as if sorry was a word he'd heard too many times to mean anything anymore. Ranch got quiet after. Too quiet. When I saw you today, saw him taking your girl. He paused, his jaw working. Couldn't let it happen. So this is charity? His head snapped up, and for the first time she saw real emotion in his eyes, something fierce and almost angry. No. Then what? Don't know yet, he said again, echoing his words from the wagon. But not charity. Maybe... He struggled for words, and Lydia found herself holding her breath. Maybe just people helping people. Maybe that's enough for now. It should have been terrifying, this undefined thing between strangers. But somehow, in the firelight, with Annie sleeping safely in the next room, and this quiet man offering shelter without demands, it felt like the first honest thing anyone had said to her in years. I'll earn my keep, Lydia said firmly. I'll cook and clean and help with whatever needs doing. And when I've worked off what you paid for us, wasn't buying you, Caleb interrupted, his voice sharp. Was buying your freedom. Different thing. Then I'm in your debt. No debt. Caleb, no debt, he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. You want to help around the place? Fine. But you don't owe me anything. You and the girl, you're free to leave any time. Door's not locked. Town's 3 hours south. You want to go? Go. Lydia stared at him, searching for the lie, for the catch, for the trap. But his eyes were steady, honest in a way that made her throat tight. I don't have anywhere else to go, she admitted quietly. Then stay. He stood, gathering the blankets. But stay because you want to, not because you think you have to. He walked to the door, clearly intending to sleep in the barn despite her protests. Caleb? He paused, looking back. Thank you, Lydia said. For today. For this. For everything. He nodded once, then disappeared into the night, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her sleeping daughter and the strange, fragile hope beginning to bloom in her chest. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its pack. But inside the house, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lydia felt something she'd almost forgotten existed, the possibility of peace. She stood by the window for a long time, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, and wondered what tomorrow would bring to this place of quiet wind and second chances, to this man who spoke in silences and saved strangers, to this life that had appeared out of nowhere when she'd lost all hope. In the barn, Caleb made his bed in fresh hay, listening to the sounds of the horses settling for the night. His hands still remembered the feel of Annie's cornhusk doll, the weight of it impossibly light. His daughter had had a doll once, made of cloth and buttons, that she'd carried everywhere until the fever took her. He closed his eyes, but sleep was elusive. The ranch was different tonight. The silence that had been his refuge for 4 years felt less heavy, somehow. Like a burden beginning, just barely, to lift. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Barrett Clay wasn't a man who forgot grudges. The work of the ranch wouldn't pause for domestic arrangements. And there were 2 strangers sleeping in his house, changing everything without meaning to. But for tonight, Caleb let himself feel something he'd thought died with his family. The sense that maybe, possibly, life still had some kindness left in it after all. Dawn came slowly to the valley, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed too beautiful for a world that had shown Lydia so much cruelty. She woke to unfamiliar silence. No sounds of vendors setting up in the alley behind her boarding house room. No shouts of drunks stumbling home from the saloon. No crying babies in adjacent rooms. Just birdsong and the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through pine trees. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back, the marketplace, Barrett Clay's cold smile, the rope biting into her wrists, Annie's screams, and the quiet man who had stepped forward when no one else would. Annie still slept beside her, one small hand curled against her cheek, her breathing deep and peaceful. Lydia slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake her, and padded barefoot across the rough wooden floor. Through the window she could see smoke rising from the barn's chimney. Caleb was already awake. She dressed quickly in her patched dress, the only one she owned besides the even more threadbare one she'd been washing the day before, and tried to do something with her hair, which had escaped its braid during the night. There was no mirror in the room, which was probably a mercy. She knew what she looked like. Worn out, used up, older than her 28 years. The main room was cold, the fire from last night reduced to ash. Lydia set about building a new one, grateful for the skills learned during years of poverty. Within minutes, flames were crackling, and she turned her attention to the kitchen. Caleb had basics: flour, salt, lard, a few eggs in a basket, bacon hanging from a hook, more food than she'd had access to in months. She was mixing biscuit dough when the door opened. Caleb entered, his hat dusted with morning dew, his face already showing the day's growth of beard. He stopped when he saw her, surprise flickering across his features. "You're up early," Lydia said, keeping her voice quiet so as not to wake Annie. "I hope you don't mind. I thought I'd make breakfast." Caleb hung his hat on a peg by the door. "Didn't need to." "I wanted to." She shaped the dough into rounds and placed them in a pan. "You said I didn't owe you anything, and I believe you meant it. But I need to do something. I can't just take without giving." He moved to the basin, pumped water, and washed his hands and face with economical movements. When he turned back, water dripped from his hair, and Lydia noticed a scar running along his left jaw, old, long-heeled, the kind that came from violence or accident. "Chores need doing," he said finally. "Could use help if you're willing." Relief flooded through her. Purpose, structure, a way to make herself useful. "Anything, whatever you need. Chicken coop's been neglected, garden too, mending, washing, cooking." He gestured vaguely. "Been managing alone but barely." "I'm good at all of that," Lydia said quickly. "I took in washing and dustridge. I can sew. I kept a garden before Samuel died. I believe you." His eyes met hers, steady and calm, not questioning your ability. They stood in silence for a moment, the awkwardness of strangers trying to establish new rhythms. Then Caleb cleared his throat. "Coffee?" "Please." He made it strong and black, the way men who worked outdoors seemed to prefer it. Lydia added generous amounts of milk to hers, trying to cut the bitterness. They sat at the table, not speaking, watching the day brighten beyond the windows. "About yesterday," Lydia began. "When Barrett implied that we... Doesn't matter what he implied. It matters to me." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, needing something to hold on to. "People will talk. They'll assume things." "People always assume things." "Doesn't that bother you?" Caleb shrugged. "Can't control what people think. Can only control what's true." "And what's true?" He looked at her directly, his gray eyes unwavering. "Truth is you needed help. Truth is I gave it. Everything else is noise." The biscuits were ready. Lydia pulled them from the oven, golden brown, better than yesterday's batch, and set about frying bacon and eggs. The domestic normalcy of it felt surreal after yesterday's terror, like she'd stepped through a door into someone else's life. Annie emerged from the bedroom, her hair a wild tangle, her corn-husk doll clutched under one arm. She stopped when she saw Caleb, suddenly shy, then climbed into Lydia's lap. "Morning, sweetheart," Lydia murmured, kissing the top of her head. "Did you sleep well?" Annie nodded, then peeked at Caleb from the safety of her mother's embrace. "Morning, Mr. Quiet." Something softened in Caleb's expression. He nodded back. "Morning." "Why are you called Mr. Quiet?" Annie asked with the fearless curiosity of children. "Don't you like talking?" "Annie," Lydia started, but Caleb held up a hand. "Talking's fine," he said carefully. "Just don't always have things to say." "Mama says thinking before talking is a virtue," Annie informed him. "But she also says I don't have that virtue yet because I'm only 4. Despite himself, Caleb's mouth twitched, almost a smile. You're honest. That's a virtue, too. Breakfast was strange and comfortable at once. Annie chattered about her doll, about the big bed, about the chickens she'd heard that morning. Lydia ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying not to think about how many meals she'd skipped to make sure Annie had enough. Caleb ate in his methodical way, occasionally glancing at them as if confirming they were really there. After breakfast, Caleb stood and reached for his hat. Got fence line to check. Storm last week knocked some posts down. Can I come? Annie asked immediately. Annie, Mr. Roan has work to do, Lydia said. Caleb, he corrected quietly, then looked at Annie. It's a long ride. Boring. I like horses, Annie said hopefully. Caleb glanced at Lydia, a question in his eyes. She hesitated. Part of her wanted to keep Annie close after yesterday's trauma, but another part recognized that letting her daughter have normal experiences, riding with a kind man, seeing the ranch, not cowering in fear, might be exactly what she needed. If it's too much trouble, Lydia began. It's not. Caleb looked at Annie. Need to stay in the saddle. No wiggling. Can you do that? Annie nodded vigorously. Then come on. Lydia watched them go, Annie's small hand in Caleb's large one as he led her toward the barn. She stood in the doorway until they emerged, Caleb on a big bay horse with Annie sitting in front of him, her eyes wide with wonder. He'd given her his hat, and it engulfed her head comically. As they rode out, Annie waved enthusiastically, and Lydia waved back, her throat suddenly tight. 3 years. 3 years of constant fear and hunger and uncertainty, of protecting her daughter alone, of never trusting anyone. And now here was this man, this stranger, taking her child riding as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She turned back to the house, determined to prove her worth. The kitchen needed thorough cleaning. The floor wanted scrubbing. The windows were grimy with dust. She worked with single-minded focus, the way she'd learned to work in Dustridge when the only thing between her and starvation was the next load of laundry, the next meal cooked, the next floor swept. By mid-morning, the main room gleamed. Lydia moved to the chicken coop next, finding it in deplorable condition. Dirty straw, broken nesting boxes, water troughs thick with algae. The chickens themselves looked bedraggled, their feathers dull. She spent 2 hours mucking out the coop, replacing straw, repairing boxes with scrap wood she found in the barn, scrubbing troughs until they were clean. The garden was worse. Weeds had taken over what had once been neat rows. A few hardy vegetables struggled for survival, some squash, carrots, onions, but most of the plot was chaos. Lydia knelt in the dirt and began pulling weeds, her hands remembering the rhythm even after years away from gardening. The sun climbed higher, warming her back. Sweat dampened her dress. But there was satisfaction in the work, in seeing order emerge from chaos. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear the horse return until Annie called out, "Mama, Mama, look, I rode a horse!" Lydia stood brushing dirt from her skirt and smiled at her daughter's excitement. Caleb dismounted and helped Annie down, steadying her when she wobbled, her legs apparently unaccustomed to riding. "We saw cows," Annie announced, "and a hawk. And Mr. All right. Quiet, let me hold the reins." "Did you?" Lydia looked at Caleb, who shrugged slightly. "She did fine." "I was very brave," Annie informed her mother seriously. "Even when the horse went fast." Caleb's eyes moved past Lydia to the chicken coop, then to the garden, taking in the morning's work. Something changed in his expression, surprise again, and something else. Respect, maybe. "Didn't expect all this," he said. "I told you I'd help." Lydia felt defensive suddenly. "If it's not what you wanted, it's good." He nodded toward the garden. "Better than good. Haven't had time to keep up with it." "What else needs doing?" Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and Lydia had the sense he was recalibrating something, adjusting his expectations. "Mending," he said finally. "Got clothes in the barn that need patching, tack that needs repair, but that can wait. You should rest." "I don't need to rest. You worked all morning. So did you." They stood facing each other, neither willing to back down. Annie looked between them, confused by the sudden tension. "Lunch?" Lydia suggested finally, breaking the standoff. Caleb nodded. "I'll wash up." Lunch was leftovers from breakfast with bread Lydia baked while Caleb was gone. They ate mostly in silence, though Annie filled the quiet with her chatter about the morning's adventure, about the cows' funny faces, and how high up everything looked from horseback. After lunch, Caleb disappeared into the barn with tools. Lydia found his mending exactly where he'd said, a pile of shirts and pants that looked like they'd been neglected for months, maybe longer. Some had tears from barbed wire. Others had simply worn through with use. She settled in the rocking chair by the fireplace with needle and thread, Annie playing nearby with her doll. The afternoon passed in peaceful industry. Through the open door, Lydia could hear Caleb hammering in the barn. Annie hummed to herself, creating elaborate stories about her doll's adventures. Lydia's fingers worked automatically, stitching torn fabric, reinforcing weak seams, replacing buttons. It was work she'd done 1,000 times, but today it felt different. She wasn't mending for strangers who paid her pennies and complained about her speed. She was mending for the man who had saved her daughter. She was examining a particularly bad tear in a work shirt when a shadow fell across the doorway. Caleb stood there, hesitant, as if unsure whether to enter his own house. "Come in," Lydia said. "It's your home." He entered, moving to the basin to wash grease from his hands. "Fix the plow. Should work now when planting season comes." "That's good. Found some old dresses in a trunk." He gestured toward a bundle he'd set by the door. "My wife's. Thought maybe, if you wanted." Lydia set down her mending. The offer was kind, but accepting a dead woman's clothes felt strange, too intimate for their undefined relationship. "I couldn't. They're just sitting there," Caleb interrupted. "Doing no good to anyone. You need clothes. They're there." He paused. "Sarah would have wanted someone to use them." Sarah. His wife had a name now. Lydia wondered what she'd been like. This woman who had loved the quiet rancher, who had died and left him alone in this big empty valley. "Thank you," Lydia said softly. "That's very kind." Caleb nodded and retreated to his other bedroom, the one Lydia hadn't seen yet, and emerged with an armload of leather straps and buckles. He settled at the table and began working on what looked like harness repair. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that falls between people who don't need to fill every moment with words. Annie eventually fell asleep on the sofa, exhausted by her morning adventure. The sun moved across the sky, painting the room in changing light. "Can I ask you something?" Lydia said finally, not looking up from her stitching. Caleb's hand stilled. "Yes." "Why don't you talk much? Is it just your nature, or—" She trailed off, unsure how to finish without being rude. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, after they died, Sarah and Emma, talking felt wrong. Like if I spoke, I'd have to admit they were really gone. So I stopped, got used to quiet, got comfortable with it. He resumed his work. "Now words feel excessive, most of the time. But not all the time." "Not all the time," he agreed. "Annie's right, you know," Lydia said. "Thinking before talking is a virtue. Most people could learn from it. And you talk enough for both of us." It took Lydia a moment to realize he was teasing, gently, but definitely teasing. She looked up and found him watching her, that almost smile playing at his mouth. "Someone has to," she replied, surprised by her own boldness. "Otherwise it's like living in a library." "Nothing wrong with libraries." "No, but they're not very lively." "Sometimes lively is overrated." They fell silent again, but the quality of it had shifted, warmer somehow, less like strangers coexisting and more like people finding their rhythm. Lydia finished the shirt she'd been working on and held it up. The repair was neat, nearly invisible. She added it to the growing pile of mended clothes. "You're good at that," Caleb observed. "I've had practice." Lydia reached for another item. "When Samuel died, I had to find ways to make money. Took in mending, washing, anything I could do. The women in town—" She paused, old bitterness rising. "They were happy to pay me pennies for work they didn't want to do themselves, but they weren't so happy when I needed help." "You asked for help?" "Once." The memory still stung. "When Annie got sick last winter. She had a fever so high I thought I'd lose her. I went to the church, begged them for money to see the doctor. They said they'd pray for her." Lydia's hands tightened on the fabric. "Prayer doesn't cure pneumonia. Medicine does. I sold everything we had. My wedding ring, Samuel's pocket watch, even my good shoes. Barely got enough. Caleb's jaw tightened. She recovered. Obviously, Lydia gestured toward the sleeping Annie. But I learned something that day. People will let you drown as long as they don't have to watch. They'll close their eyes, say a prayer, and call themselves good Christians. Not everyone. No, Lydia admitted, looking at him. Not everyone. The afternoon wore into evening. Caleb went out to do evening chores, feeding cattle, checking water troughs, securing the barn. Lydia started dinner using the last of the bacon and some carrots from the neglected garden. Annie woke and helped set the table, her version of help consisting mostly of moving things around while chattering about everything and nothing. When Caleb returned, they ate together as if it were something they'd done 100 times instead of twice. After dinner, Annie presented him with something she'd made while Lydia cooked, a crown woven from grass and wildflowers she'd gathered that morning, now slightly wilted but still beautiful in the way of a child's creation. For you, she announced solemnly. Because you're nice. Caleb stared at the crown in Annie's outstretched hands. For a moment, Lydia thought he might refuse. Then, very carefully, he took it and placed it on his head. It sat there, absurdly cheerful against his weathered face, flowers drooping over his forehead. Annie clapped delightedly. You look like a king. A king needs a crown, Caleb said seriously, as if discussing ranch business. He wore it through the rest of dinner, through Annie's bedtime routine, even while washing dishes. When Lydia caught his eye, questioning, he simply shrugged. She made it, he said, as if that explained everything. Later, after Annie was asleep and Caleb had finally removed the crown, hanging it carefully on a peg by the door, Lydia found herself alone with him by the fire. She'd intended to retreat to the bedroom, to give him space, but something made her pause. Thank you, she said, for wearing the crown. It meant a lot to her. It's just flowers. No, it's not. It's Annie learning to trust again, learning that men can be kind. Lydia swallowed hard. Learning that not everyone is like Barrett Clay. Caleb poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. What will you do? What do you mean? Long term. You can stay here long as you need, but eventually... He trailed off. Eventually I need a plan, Lydia finished. She'd been trying not to think about it. I don't know. Go back to Dustridge, maybe. Find work. Try to save enough to... She stopped, hearing how hollow it sounded. They'd barely survived in Dustridge before. Going back seemed like choosing to drown. Or, Caleb said carefully, you could stay. Lydia's heart skipped. Stay? Ranch needs work. I need help. You need a place. He kept his eyes on the fire. Makes sense. As what? Your housekeeper? As whatever you want to be. He finally looked at her. I'm not good with words, not good with people. But I know when something works. Today worked. You fit here. I fit here, Lydia repeated slowly, testing the words. If you want to. It was too much, too fast. Yesterday she'd been on her knees in the dirt, watching her daughter be taken. Today she was sitting by a fire in a safe house, being offered a future. It felt unreal, like something that would vanish if she touched it too hard. I need to think about it, she said finally. Take your time. Caleb stood, stretching. I'll be in the barn. Caleb, you don't have to. I know, but he was already reaching for his hat. Need to check on a mare anyway. Might foal tonight. He was gone before Lydia could protest further. She sat alone by the fire, her thoughts spinning. Through the window she could see lamplight in the barn, Caleb's shadow moving across it. A kind man. A lonely man. A man offering shelter without demands, asking nothing but her presence. It should have been terrifying. Every instinct she'd developed over 3 years of widowhood screamed that this was too good, that there had to be a catch, that kindness always came with a price. But sitting in the warm house, listening to her daughter breathe peacefully in the next room, Lydia found herself wanting to believe, wanting to trust, wanting to imagine that maybe, just maybe, some men were exactly what they appeared to be. Decent human beings trying their best in a hard world, She looked at the crown Annie had made, hanging on its peg by the door, flowers already brown at the edges, but preserved with care. A small thing, a simple thing. But in that gesture, a quiet man wearing a child's gift without embarrassment, Lydia saw more kindness than she'd found in all of Dustridge's so-called good Christian people. Maybe staying wasn't madness. Maybe it was wisdom. The fire burned low. Outside, a coyote called to the moon. And in the barn, Caleb sat with the mare, waiting for new life to enter the world, thinking about the woman and child sleeping in his house and how, for the first time in 4 years, the ranch didn't feel quite so empty anymore. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Caleb rose before dawn to handle the cattle and horses. Lydia woke shortly after to prepare breakfast, the smell of coffee and frying bacon becoming the ranch's morning rhythm. Annie slept late, exhausted by fresh air and freedom, then woke full of energy and questions. The division of labor established itself naturally. Caleb handled the heavy outdoor work, fence repair, cattle management, equipment maintenance. Lydia took over the house and garden, the chickens and cooking, the endless small tasks that kept a home running. Annie helped wherever her small hands could manage, gathering eggs with fierce concentration, pulling weeds with determined enthusiasm, chattering constantly to whoever would listen. They spoke little at first, but the silences weren't uncomfortable. Caleb wasn't a man who needed conversation to feel connected. Lydia learned to read his moods in other ways, the set of his shoulders when something worried him, the slight softening around his eyes when Annie made him almost smile, the way his hands stilled when he was thinking hard about something. On the third day, Lydia found the courage to explore Sarah's trunk. The dresses inside were simple but well made, certainly better than her patched and worn clothing. She chose a blue cotton dress that needed only minor alterations, letting out seams where Sarah had been smaller, taking up the hem slightly. When she emerged wearing it, Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Suits you," he said finally. It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd heard in years. By the end of the first week, Annie had claimed Caleb as her own. She followed him around like a shadow whenever he allowed it, asking endless questions about the cattle, the horses, why grass was green, where clouds came from, and whether chickens had feelings. Caleb answered her questions with surprising patience, his responses brief but thoughtful. "Do you ever get lonely, Mr. Quiet?" Annie asked one afternoon while they fed the chickens together. Lydia, hanging laundry nearby, held her breath. "Used to," Caleb replied. "Less now." "Because we're here?" "Because you're here." Annie beamed as if he'd given her a treasure. That evening, Lydia found something left on the kitchen table. A bar of lavender soap, still wrapped in its paper, the kind sold at the general store in Dustridge. She'd mentioned missing the scent days ago, barely aware she'd spoken the thought aloud. But Caleb had heard, had remembered, and had ridden 3 hours to town and back to buy it. She held the soap, her eyes burning with unexpected tears. When Caleb came in for supper, she tried to thank him. "It's just soap," he said, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It's not just soap." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words, beyond the practical arrangement they'd made. A recognition that what was happening in this quiet ranch house was more than convenience, more than necessity. It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find again. That night, after Annie was asleep, Lydia made her decision. She found Caleb in the barn, checking on the new foal that had been born that first night, a spindly-legged colt with its mother's gentle eyes. "I'd like to stay," she said without preamble. "If the offer still stands." Caleb straightened, hay dust in his hair, his hands still gentle on the foal. "It stands. I need to know what you expect. I need clear terms." "Terms," Caleb repeated, as if the word were foreign. "Yes. How long? What happens if it doesn't work out? What? She struggled for the right words. "What are we to each other?" Caleb leaned against the stall, considering. "Stay as long as you want. Leave whenever you want. What we are..." He paused. "Don't know yet. Friends, maybe. People who help each other. Maybe more someday, maybe not. Don't need to decide now. That's not very specific. Life isn't specific." His eyes met hers. "We'll figure it out as we go." It wasn't the clear answer Lydia had hoped for, but somehow it was better. No false promises, no grand declarations, just honesty and possibility and the chance to build something real. All right, she said, we'll figure it out as we go. Caleb nodded, and in that moment, standing in the lamplight of the barn with the smell of hay and horses around them and the sounds of the night prairie filtering through the walls, Lydia felt something she hadn't felt since Samuel died. Hope for a future that might actually be worth living. 3 weeks passed in the kind of peace that made Lydia nervous. She'd learned long ago that peace was temporary, that somewhere in the world someone was always sharpening a knife meant for your back. But the days at the ranch unfolded with gentle monotony. Morning chores, afternoon work, evening meals by the fire. Annie grew rounder, her cheeks filling out with regular food. Caleb remained quiet, but present, a steady force that anchored their small household. And Lydia, despite her wariness, began to relax into something that felt dangerously close to happiness. It was a Tuesday evening when everything shattered. Lydia was preparing supper, slicing potatoes, while Annie played with wooden blocks Caleb had carved for her. The late October sun slanted through the windows, painting everything gold. Caleb was outside dealing with a stubborn fence post that kept tilting. The normalcy of it all felt almost sacred. Then Annie looked up from her blocks, her small face suddenly alert. "Mama, what's that smell?" Lydia paused, knife in hand. She sniffed the air and felt her blood turn to ice. Smoke. Not the clean smoke of a cooking fire or a chimney, the thick, acrid smoke of something burning that shouldn't be. She dropped the knife and ran to the window. At first she saw nothing, then she spotted it. A thin gray column rising from behind the barn, thickening even as she watched, turning from gray to black, and suddenly there were flames, orange and terrible, clawing at the darkening sky. "Caleb!" The scream tore from her throat. She grabbed Annie, clutching her daughter tight. "Caleb, the barn's on fire!" He appeared from around the corner of the house, took one look at the flames, and ran. Not toward safety, not away from danger, but straight into it, toward the barn where the horses were screaming, where the new colt was trapped, where everything could be lost in minutes. "Stay in the house!" Lydia shouted at Annie, setting her down. "Don't move from this spot!" She ran after Caleb, her skirts tangling around her legs. The heat hit her 50 feet from the barn, a wall of scorching air that stole her breath. The flames had spread with terrifying speed, already consuming the hayloft, spreading along the dry timber walls. Inside, she could hear the animals panicking, the horses shrieking in terror. Caleb had already thrown open the barn doors, smoke billowed out, thick and choking. He plunged inside without hesitation, disappearing into that black hell. "Caleb!" Lydia reached the door, tried to follow, but the smoke drove her back, burning her lungs, blinding her. "Caleb, please!" A horse burst from the barn, wild-eyed with fear, nearly trampling her as it fled toward the open pasture. Then another. Then the mare with her colt stumbling beside her, both of them singed but alive. Caleb emerged, his face black with soot, coughing so hard his whole body shook. Before Lydia could stop him, he turned back toward the inferno. "There's more!" he choked out. "2 more horses! You'll die!" Lydia grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his shirt. "Let them go!" He shook her off, not roughly, but firmly, and plunged back into the smoke. Lydia stood frozen, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Seconds felt like hours. The barn groaned, timber cracking under the assault of flame. Part of the roof collapsed with a shower of sparks. "Caleb!" She was screaming now, her voice raw. "Caleb, get out now!" Another horse appeared, rearing and bucking, foam at its mouth. It careened past her, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Still, Caleb didn't emerge. The smoke was so thick now she couldn't see into the barn at all, just a black void lit from within by hellish orange light. Then, finally, thank God, finally, a shape materialized. Caleb staggered out, dragging the last horse by its halter, the animal fighting him with every step. He released it, and the horse bolted. Caleb took 3 steps and collapsed. Lydia reached him in seconds, her hands on his face, his shoulders. "Are you hurt?" "Caleb, talk to me." He was coughing too hard to speak, his eyes streaming, his hands blistered and bleeding. She could see burns on his arms where embers had landed, could smell singed hair and cloth. But he was alive. He was breathing. The animals, he gasped out. Got them all. I don't care about the animals. Lydia was crying now, tears cutting through the soot on her own face. You could have died. Couldn't let them burn. He tried to sit up, coughed so violently he nearly vomited. Couldn't! A beam inside the barn crashed down with an explosion of sparks. The entire structure was engulfed now, flames reaching 30 feet into the air, casting dancing shadows across the ranch. Lydia helped Caleb away from the heat, toward the house where Annie stood in the doorway, her face white with terror. Mr. Quiet! Annie ran to them, throwing herself at Caleb with such force she nearly knocked him over. I was so scared! I'm fine, Caleb managed, his voice like gravel. I'm fine, little one. But he wasn't fine. Lydia could see that. His hands shook. His breathing was labored. Blood seeped through his shirt where burns had broken skin. She got him to the porch, made him sit while she ran for water, for clean cloths, for anything that might help. We should get the doctor, she said, examining his hands in the lamplight. The burns were bad, blisters already forming. No doctor. Caleb pulled away slightly. I've had worse. Don't be stubborn. No doctor, he repeated, his tone brooking no argument. Lydia wanted to fight him, wanted to insist, but she recognized that particular set to his jaw. Instead, she cleaned his wounds as best she could, wrapping his hands in strips of cloth torn from an old sheet. His arms bore similar treatment. A burn on his shoulder made him wince when she touched it, but he didn't cry out. Through it all, the barn burned. They could do nothing but watch as months of work, of stored hay and equipment and shelter, turned to ash and ember. The flames painted everything in flickering orange like a glimpse of damnation come to earth. How did it start? Lydia asked quietly, once Caleb's worst injuries were tended. Annie had fallen asleep against him, exhausted by fear, and he held her gently despite his damaged hands. Don't know. But something in his voice suggested he suspected. Caleb, what aren't you telling me? He was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames. Found something earlier today. Broken fence on the south pasture. Not weather damage. Wire was cut clean through. Lydia's stomach dropped. Cut? You mean someone meant to let the cattle out, meant to cause trouble? His jaw tightened. Should have realized he wouldn't stop there. Barrett. The name was poison on her tongue. You think Barrett Clay did this? Don't think. No. Caleb shifted Annie carefully, cradling her against his chest. Saw boot prints in the mud near the fence. Expensive boots, the kind of man like Clay wears. He looked at Lydia, his gray eyes hard as stone in the firelight. He's making good on his threat, showing me what happens when someone crosses him. Fear and fury warred in Lydia's chest. We should tell the sheriff. Sheriff's in Clay's pocket. Everyone knows it. Caleb's voice was flat, defeated. Clay owns half of Dustridge. Who's going to believe us over him? So what? We just let him get away with it? Let him burn your home, terrorize us? Don't know what else to do. For the first time since she'd known him, Caleb sounded lost. I'm just a rancher. He's got money, power, connections. I speak up, he'll find ways to hurt you. Hurt Annie. Can't risk that. Lydia wanted to argue, wanted to insist they fight back, but she knew he was right. She'd seen how Barrett operated in Dustridge, how he destroyed anyone who opposed him with casual efficiency. And now they'd made an enemy of him, all because Caleb had dared to show kindness. I'm sorry, she whispered. This is my fault. If I hadn't owed him money, if you hadn't... Stop. Caleb's voice was firm despite his exhaustion. This isn't your fault. It's his. He's the one who preys on desperate people. He's the one who burns barns and cuts fences. Don't carry his sin. They sat in silence, watching the fire burn itself out. Eventually the flames diminished, leaving only glowing embers and twisted metal and the charred skeleton of what had been. The smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, a reminder that safety was an illusion, that cruelty could find you even in the middle of nowhere. Lydia carried Annie to bed, tucking her in with trembling hands. When she returned to the main room, she found Caleb still sitting on the porch, staring at the ruins of his barn. She brought him water, which he drank mechanically, and sat beside him. What will you do? She asked. Rebuild? He said it simply, as if it were obvious. What else can I do? That will take time. Money. Got some saved. Won't be fancy, but it'll shelter the animals. He flexed his bandaged hands carefully, wincing, assuming I can work with these. I'll help. The words came without thought. However I can. Whatever you need. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something shift. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Lydia's voice was fierce. You saved my daughter. You gave us shelter when we had nothing. You think I'm going to abandon you the first time things get hard? This isn't your fight. Like hell it isn't. She was surprised by her own vehemence. Barrett Clay made it my fight when he tried to take my child. You made it my fight when you stepped forward to help us. We're in this together now, whether you want us to be or not. Something in Caleb's expression softened. He reached out with one bandaged hand and touched her face, just briefly, his fingers gentle against her cheek. You're fierce, he said quietly. Fiercer than you look. 3 years of survival will do that to a person. They sat together as the night deepened, as stars emerged overhead and the embers of the barn cooled to ash. Somewhere in the hills, a coyote howled. The horses moved nervously in the pasture, still spooked by the fire. But on the porch, Lydia felt something she hadn't expected: resolve. Barrett Clay had meant to break them, to punish them for defying him. Instead, he'd forged something stronger. The next morning dawned cold and gray, matching Lydia's mood. She woke early and found Caleb already outside, surveying the damage by daylight. The barn was a total loss. Nothing but blackened timbers and ash. The chicken coop had survived and the house was untouched, but the loss was still devastating. Caleb's hands were swollen and painful. She could tell by the careful way he held them. When she brought him coffee, she saw him wince as he took the cup. "Let me change those bandages," she said. He didn't argue this time. She unwrapped his hands carefully, her stomach turning at the sight of the blisters and burns. Some had broken open during the night, weeping clear fluid. She cleaned them with boiled water, applied a salve she'd made from herbs in the garden, and wrapped them fresh. "You need to rest," she told him. "Give these time to heal." "Can't rest. Too much work." "Then let me do it." Caleb shook his head. "You don't know how? Then teach me." Lydia met his eyes. "I'm strong. I'm capable. And I'm not going to stand by while you work yourself to death with injured hands." They spent the morning clearing debris, Lydia doing the heavy lifting while Caleb directed with increasing frustration. He wasn't accustomed to being the one unable to work, wasn't comfortable accepting help, but his hands made heavy labor impossible, and eventually he had to concede. Annie helped in her way, carrying small pieces of wood to a pile, chattering to fill the heavy silence. She seemed to sense the adult's tension, trying to lighten it with her endless questions and observations. "Will we build a new barn, Mr. Quiet?" she asked. "Yes." "Will it be big?" "Big enough." "Can I help?" Caleb looked at her, and despite everything, almost smiled. "You can help." They were taking a break for lunch when Lydia heard it, the thunder of hooves, growing louder, approaching fast. She straightened, shading her eyes against the noon sun, and felt her blood turn cold. Riders. A dozen of them, at least, coming from the south at a gallop, dust rising in their wake like smoke. At their head, unmistakable even from a distance, was Barrett Clay. "Get Annie inside," Caleb said, his voice deadly calm. "Lock the door. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Caleb, now Lydia." She grabbed Annie's hand and ran for the house. Inside, she locked the door as instructed, then moved to the window where she could see. Annie clung to her skirt, sensing danger. "Mama, I'm scared." "It's all right, baby. Mr. Quiet will keep us safe." But Lydia wasn't sure she believed her own words. Caleb stood alone in the yard, his bandaged hands at his sides, facing down Barrett Clay and his small army. The riders formed a semicircle around him, trapping him, their horses stamping and snorting. Several held torches despite the daylight, flames dancing in the breeze. Barrett dismounted with theatrical flair, his expensive suit immaculate, his silver-topped cane gleaming. He looked around at the burned barn with exaggerated concern. "My goodness, Roan," he said, his voice carrying clearly to where Lydia listened. "What a terrible tragedy. A fire, was it? How unfortunate." Caleb said nothing, just watched Barrett with those storm gray eyes. You should be more careful, Barrett continued, walking a slow circle around Caleb. Accidents happen so easily on isolated ranches. Fires start. Fences get cut. Sometimes worse things occur. He paused. Sometimes people get hurt. Say what you came to say. Caleb's voice was steady despite being outnumbered. Barrett's smile vanished. I came to deliver a message. You embarrassed me in front of the whole town. You stole what was rightfully mine, a debt that needed paying, labor that was owed. I paid the debt, in gold. You paid the money, not the humiliation. Barrett stepped closer, his face twisting with rage. Do you know what people said after you left? That I'd been bested by some silent hermit. That Clay's losing his touch. That maybe I'm not as powerful as everyone thinks. Not my problem. The words were like striking a match. Barrett's face flushed red. He raised his cane and swung it hard, catching Caleb across the ribs. Caleb stumbled but didn't fall, didn't cry out, just straightened and kept staring at Barrett with those implacable eyes. Inside the house, Lydia bit her fist to keep from screaming. Here's how this works, Barrett snarled. You have two choices. One, you give me back the woman and her brat. Let them fulfill their contract, and I'll forget about this whole unfortunate business. No. Or two, Barrett gestured to his men, who moved their horses closer, tightening the circle. You learn what happens to people who cross me. Your barn was just a warning. Next time it might be your house. Or maybe something happens to that woman you've been harboring. Maybe she has an accident. Maybe her daughter disappears one night. Tragic things happen in wild country, Rowan. Everyone knows that. The threat hung in the air like poison. Lydia felt Annie trembling against her, felt her own heart hammering with primal fear. She looked around desperately for something, anything she could use as a weapon. Her eyes fell on the rifle hanging above the fireplace. Caleb's rifle, loaded and ready. She'd never fired a gun in her life. Outside, Caleb's hands had curled into fists despite the pain it must have caused. Touch them, he said, his voice low and deadly, and I'll kill you. Barrett laughed. You? Kill me? Look at you. You can barely move your hands. You're alone. I've got 12 men. You've got nothing. I've got them, Caleb gestured toward the house. And they're worth more than everything you own. You want to hurt them? You'll have to go through me. That can be arranged. Barrett nodded to his men. Two of them dismounted, moving toward Caleb with the casual confidence of men who'd done violence before. Caleb stood his ground, his injured hands raised despite the futility of it. The first man reached him, threw a punch. Caleb dodged, moved in close, drove his elbow into the man's throat. The man went down gasping. The second man was smarter, grabbed Caleb from behind, pinning his arms. A third joined in, and suddenly Caleb was on the ground, taking kicks to his ribs, his back, his head. Lydia couldn't stand it anymore. She grabbed the rifle, fumbled with the lock on the door, and burst outside. Stop! She raised the rifle, her hand shaking so badly she could barely aim. Get away from him or I'll shoot! The men paused. Barrett turned to her, his eyebrows raised. Well, well, the widow has teeth. I mean it. Lydia tried to keep her voice steady. I'll put a bullet in anyone who touches him again. Do you even know how to use that thing? Honestly, no, but she pulled the trigger anyway. The shot went wide, missing everyone but sending up a spray of dirt near the horse's feet. The animals spooked, rearing and bucking. One of Barrett's men nearly got thrown. The noise was deafening in the quiet valley. Everyone froze. Lydia worked the lever, chambering another round with shaking hands. Next one won't miss. Barrett's expression had gone cold. You're making a very serious mistake, Mrs. Harrow. The mistake was yours when you threatened my daughter. For a long moment, no one moved. Caleb struggled to his feet, blood running from his nose. His breathing labored. He moved to stand beside Lydia, and she felt his presence like a shield. This isn't over, Barrett said finally. Not by a long shot. You want to protect them, Rowan? Fine. But you can't watch them every second. You can't guard them forever. Sooner or later you'll slip. And when you do... He smiled, cold and terrible. Well, accidents happen, especially to people who don't know their place. He mounted his horse with fluid grace, his men following suit. They wheeled around, preparing to leave. But Barrett paused, looking back. Oh, and Roan? In case you're thinking about running to the sheriff, don't bother. He knows better than to take your word over mine. This is my county, my rules. You're just living in it. They rode off in a cloud of dust, their laughter carrying on the wind. Lydia stood frozen, the rifle still in her hands, her whole body shaking with reaction. Beside her, Caleb swayed, then sat down hard. Are you hurt? She dropped the rifle and knelt beside him. Caleb, talk to me. I'm fine. But he wasn't. She could see him favoring his ribs, see blood on his shirt. You shouldn't have come out. Should have stayed inside where it was safe. Safe? Lydia's voice broke. You were being beaten. I wasn't going to just watch. You could have been hurt. Annie could have... We're a family. The words burst from her before she could stop them. At least, we're something close to it, and families protect each other. You don't get to be the only one who does the protecting. Caleb stared at her, something raw and vulnerable in his expression. You fired a gun for me. I'd do worse than that. She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight. Come on, let's get you inside. You need rest. He didn't argue this time, letting her guide him into the house where Annie waited, her small face streaked with tears. She ran to Caleb, wrapping her arms around his legs. You're bleeding, she cried. Mama, he's bleeding. I know, sweetheart. Help me get him to the sofa. They got him settled, and Lydia set about tending his wounds. More than his hands now, cuts on his face, bruises blooming across his ribs, scrapes and contusions that would hurt for days. He endured her ministrations in silence, his eyes distant. We should leave, he said finally. Pack up, go somewhere Clay can't find you. Montana, maybe. Or Oregon. No. Lydia, you heard him. He's not going to stop. I said no. She met his eyes. We're not running. This is our home now. We're not letting him take it from us. It's not worth dying for. Maybe not. She touched his face gently, careful of the bruises. But you might be. The words hung between them, fragile and enormous. Caleb's eyes widened slightly, and Lydia realized what she'd just said, what she'd just admitted. She started to pull back, to take it back, but Caleb caught her hand. You don't mean that, he said quietly. Don't tell me what I mean. She squeezed his hand. You saved my daughter. You gave us a home. You stood up to Barrett Clay twice now, knowing what it would cost. If that's not worth fighting for, I don't know what is. Annie climbed onto the sofa beside Caleb, curling into his side despite his injuries. I don't want to leave, she said in a small voice. I like it here. I like Mr. Quiet. Caleb wrapped his arm around her, his expression softening. I like you too, little one. Then we stay, Lydia said firmly. All of us. Together. Let Barrett do his worst. We'll face it together. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains. The ruins of the barn smoldered faintly, a reminder of what they'd lost and what they stood to lose. But inside the house, in the fading light, 3 people who'd been strangers just weeks ago sat together and made a choice. Not to run, not to surrender, but to stand and fight for the fragile, precious thing they were building together. It was a choice that would cost them dearly in the days to come. But sitting there with Caleb's hand in hers and Annie sleeping peacefully between them, Lydia couldn't bring herself to regret it. Some things were worth fighting for. Some people were worth the risk. And if Barrett Clay wanted to take them apart, he'd find they were stronger together than he'd ever imagined. The days following Barrett's visit passed with agonizing slowness. Each hour stretched taut with waiting. Lydia found herself jumping at shadows, starting at every sound. Every time she looked out the window and saw dust rising in the distance, her heart would leap into her throat, certain it was Barrett and his men returning to make good on their threats. But the dust always turned out to be nothing. Wind stirring the prairie or cattle moving, or her own fear manifesting as phantoms. Caleb healed slowly, his ribs made breathing painful for the first week, turning simple tasks into ordeals. His hands improved gradually, the blisters drying and new skin forming beneath, but they remained tender and weak. Lydia watched him push through the pain with stubborn determination, trying to maintain the ranch despite his injuries, and it broke her heart a little more each day. You need to rest, she told him for the 100th time, finding him in the pasture trying to repair fence with hands that could barely grip the wire. Can't afford to rest. He didn't look at her, focusing on the work. Fence needs fixing. Barn needs rebuilding. Winter's coming, and we need shelter for the animals. Winter can wait a few more days. Your health can't. My health is fine. Your hands are bleeding through the bandages. That made him pause. He looked down at his hands as if surprised to find them attached to his body, saw the red stains spreading through the cloth, and finally, reluctantly, set down the wire. Tomorrow, he said. I'll rest tomorrow. But tomorrow came and he was up before dawn again, working despite Lydia's protests. She realized with growing frustration that arguing with Caleb Rohn was like arguing with the mountains. You could shout all you wanted, but they weren't going to move. So she changed tactics. If he wouldn't rest, she'd help him work. She learned to mend fence, her hands soon as cut and bruised as his had been before the fire. She learned to check cattle for illness, to recognize when a cow was in distress, to doctor wounds and administer basic veterinary care. Annie helped too, in her small way, bringing water, holding tools, singing songs to keep their spirits up. 2 weeks after the fire, a wagon appeared on the horizon. Lydia's hand went immediately to the rifle they now kept near the door at all times. But Caleb, squinting into the distance, shook his head. "That's not Barrett's men," he said. "That's Tom Henderson." Tom Henderson turned out to be a weathered rancher from the neighboring property, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and calloused hands. He pulled up in front of the house and climbed down stiffly, nodding to Caleb. "Heard about your barn," he said without preamble. "Heard other things, too. Thought you might could use some help." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Don't need charity." "Good, because I'm not offering any." Tom gestured to his wagon, which Lydia now saw was loaded with timber and supplies. "I'm offering neighborly assistance. There's a difference." "Tom, now you listen here, Rohn. I've known you 4 years. You're a proud man, and that's admirable. But pride's a luxury when winter's coming and you've got no barn." He paused. "Besides, my Sarah's been after me about that widow and child you took in. Says I should make sure you're treating them right, that they're not going without." Lydia stepped forward. "Mrs. Henderson sent her regards?" Tom tipped his hat to her. "She did indeed, ma'am. Also sent preserves and some dress fabric she thought you might could use. Woman's convinced the whole county is going to gossip about Caleb keeping a lady under his roof without proper supervision." He chuckled. "I told her folks in these parts got better things to do than worry about who's living where. But you know how women are." "I do," Lydia said dryly. "Being one myself." Tom had the grace to look embarrassed. "Meant no offense, ma'am." "None taken." She glanced at Caleb, who looked torn between gratitude and his stubborn independence. "We'd be grateful for the help, Mr. Henderson." "Very grateful." Over Caleb's half-hearted protests, Tom unloaded his wagon and spent the day helping mark out where the new barn would stand. As they worked, other wagons appeared. The Millers from the south property brought nails and tools. The Johnsons from the east brought food and their 3 grown sons to help with heavy lifting. By noon, a dozen people had gathered, turning the barn raising into an impromptu community event. Lydia moved among them, serving water and coffee, listening to their conversations. She learned that Caleb, despite his isolation, was respected among the neighboring ranchers. He'd helped the Millers during a harsh winter 2 years ago, providing hay when theirs ran out. He'd assisted Tom Henderson in finding stolen cattle. He'd delivered the Johnsons' youngest child when the doctor couldn't arrive in time during a spring blizzard. "He never talks about these things," Lydia said to Sarah Henderson, who had arrived with her husband bringing food enough to feed an army. "That's Caleb's way," Sarah replied, spreading out dishes on makeshift tables. "He does what needs doing without expectation of thanks or recognition. When his wife and daughter died, we thought he'd leave, sell the ranch and go somewhere without memories. But he stayed. Worked himself near to death that first year, but he stayed." She looked at Lydia appraisingly. "You're good for him. He's more alive now than he's been in 4 years." "I don't know about that. We're just—" Lydia paused, unsure how to explain their arrangement. "Your family," Sarah said firmly. "Maybe not in the traditional sense, but family nonetheless. Anyone with eyes can see how he looks at that child of yours, how he looks at you. And how you look at him." Lydia felt her face heat. "It's not like that." "Isn't it?" Sarah smiled knowingly. "Mark my words, dear. It will be. Give it time." By evening, the barn's frame stood skeletal but strong against the darkening sky. The men would return tomorrow to continue the work, they promised. Tom Henderson stayed for supper, regaling Annie with stories about the wild horses he'd broken in his youth, while Caleb listened with that almost smile playing at his lips. After everyone left, Lydia found Caleb standing in the doorway, looking out at the barn frame. "You have good neighbors," she said softly. "I do." His voice was rough with emotion he wouldn't name. Didn't realize how good until today. They care about you. They care about doing what's right. Big difference. Lydia moved to stand beside him. "Is there? Seems to me caring about doing what's right and caring about people often looks the same." He glanced at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "You fit in with them. Sarah and the others. They like you. That surprises you?" "No, just observing." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. Annie was already asleep inside, worn out by the excitement of so many people. The night was cool, promising frost before morning. "Caleb," Lydia said carefully, "if Barrett comes back while all these people are here—" "He won't." Caleb's voice was certain. "He's a coward at heart. He only strikes when his target is vulnerable and alone. With witnesses, with people who'd spread word of what he did, he'll stay away." "And after? When the barn's finished and everyone goes home? Then we'll be ready." His hand moved unconsciously to where a gun now rested at his hip, a precaution he'd taken since Barrett's visit. "He makes a move, I'll end it." The coldness in his voice sent a shiver through Lydia. This was a side of Caleb she hadn't seen, hard, dangerous, capable of violence when pushed. It should have frightened her. Instead, strangely, it made her feel safer. The barn raising took 3 days. Men worked from dawn to dusk, their hammers ringing out across the valley like a defiant bell. Women brought food and fellowship, their presence transforming the ranch into something alive and communal. Annie made friends with the Johnson children, playing games and shrieking with laughter. Lydia found herself part of something she'd never experienced, a real community, people who helped each other, not for profit, but because it was right. On the evening of the 3rd day, as the last nail was driven and the last board secured, Tom Henderson raised his flask. "To Caleb Roan," he announced. "Damn fool for living out here alone, but a good man despite it. And to his new family, may they bring light to this lonely ranch, and may no harm come to them." The men cheered, the women smiled. Caleb looked uncomfortable with the attention, but nodded his thanks. Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. These people, these near strangers, had just declared their protection over her and Annie, had just made clear that anyone who threatened them would answer to the community. As the wagons rolled away into the dusk, Lydia stood with Caleb and Annie, waving until the last one disappeared. "They'll talk, you know," Caleb said quietly, "about us, about you living here. Let them talk." Lydia was surprised by her own lack of concern. "We know the truth. That's what matters." Annie tugged at Caleb's sleeve. "Mr. Quiet, can I sleep in the new barn tonight? I want to see if it smells different than the old one." "Barns are for animals, not little girls," Lydia said, but she was smiling. "Tomorrow," Caleb told Annie. "Tomorrow you can explore all you want. Tonight you need a real bed." As Lydia tucked Annie in that night, her daughter asked a question that had clearly been building. "Mama, is Mr. Quiet going to be my new papa?" Lydia's breath caught. "Why would you ask that, sweetheart?" "Because Mrs. Henderson said we're a family now, and families have mamas and papas. I have a mama, that's you, but I don't have a papa anymore. Papa Samuel went to heaven." Annie's eyes were serious, thoughtful beyond her years. "Could Mr. Quiet be my papa? I think he'd be good at it." "I don't know, baby." Lydia smoothed Annie's hair. "These things are complicated." "Why?" Because Mr. Quiet and we're not married. We're just friends who live together." "But you like him." It wasn't a question. "And he likes you. I see how he looks at you when you're not watching, like you're special." "When did you get so observant?" Annie giggled. "I'm very clever. Mrs. Henderson said so." After Annie fell asleep, Lydia found Caleb in the new barn, running his hands over the fresh timber, breathing in the scent of new wood and hay. He'd moved the horses in already, and they stood contentedly in their stalls, nickering softly. "It's a good barn," Lydia said. "It'll do." High praise from Caleb. "Annie asked me if you were going to be her new father." The words hung in the air between them. Caleb's hand stilled on the wood. He didn't turn around. "What did you tell her?" he asked finally. "I told her it was complicated." "Is it? Isn't it?" Lydia moved closer. "We're not married. We barely know each other. A month ago we were strangers." "A month ago," Caleb repeated. He turned to face her, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. "Feels longer. Feels like you've been here always." "That's just because we've been through so much together." "Maybe." He took a step toward her. "Or maybe it's because some people fit together right from the start. Some people just belong." Lydia's heart hammered. "Caleb, I'm not good with words, you know that, but I need to say this." He took a breath. "When I saw Clay's men hurting you that first day, something in me woke up. Something that had been sleeping since Sarah and Emma died. At first I thought it was just about doing the right thing, being a decent human being, but it's more than that now." "What is it?" Lydia whispered. "It's you. It's Annie. It's this." He gestured around them, encompassing the barn, the ranch, the life they'd been building. "I was just existing before, going through motions. Now I'm living again, and I don't want to go back to existing." Lydia felt tears slide down her cheeks. "I'm scared." "So am I." "What if Barrett comes back? What if he hurts Annie? What if—" Caleb closed the distance between them and took her hands gently. "Then we'll face it together. All of us. That's what families do." "Is that what we are? A family?" "If you want to be." His gray eyes searched hers. "I know I'm not much. I'm quiet, and I'm broken, and I live in the middle of nowhere. I can't offer you fancy things or an easy life, but I can offer you protection, safety, a home, and something else, if you'll have it." "What?" "Love." The word seemed to cost him, but he said it anyway. "I love you, Lydia. I love Annie. Didn't plan to, didn't expect it. But there it is." Lydia couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She'd been proposed to before. Samuel had courted her properly, with flowers and poetry and promises. But this raw, honest declaration from a man who hoarded words like gold meant more than all of Samuel's eloquence ever had. "I love you too," she managed. "God help me, but I do." Caleb smiled then, a real smile, full and genuine, transforming his entire face. He pulled her close, and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest, hearing his heart beat strong and steady beneath her ear. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other in the new barn with the horses as witnesses. Then Caleb tipped her face up and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. It was Annie's scream that shattered the moment. They broke apart and ran for the house, Caleb's hand going to his gun. The front door stood open, swinging in the wind. Inside, Annie stood in the middle of the main room, pointing at the table with a shaking finger. "Mama, Mama, look!" On the table lay a doll, not Annie's cornhusk doll, but a porcelain doll in an expensive dress, beautiful and terrible at once, because around the doll's neck was a rope, tied in a noose, and pinned to its chest was a note. Caleb snatched up the note, his face going pale as he read. Then he handed it to Lydia. The message was simple, written in elegant script. "Pretty things break so easily. Next time it won't be a doll. Leave now or watch her die. You have 3 days." Lydia's hand shook so badly the paper rattled. She looked at Annie, who was crying now, terrified without understanding why. Looked at Caleb, who had gone absolutely still, the way predators do before they strike. "He was here," Lydia whispered. "He was in our house while we were in the barn. He could have taken her, could have... But he didn't." Caleb's voice was ice. "He's still playing games, still trying to scare us into running." "It's working." Lydia pulled Annie close. "Caleb, we can't fight this. He'll kill her. He'll kill all of us." "No." Caleb's hands clenched into fists. "No more running. No more cowering. This ends now." What are you going to do? He didn't answer, just strode to the gun cabinet and began pulling out weapons, rifles, a shotgun, boxes of ammunition. He loaded each one with methodical precision, his face set in grim lines. You're going after him, Lydia realized. You're going to Dustridge. I'm going to end this, one way or another. Or they'll kill you, Caleb, please, there has to be another way. There isn't. He checked the loads one final time, then looked at her. I won't let him hurt you, won't let him take Annie. If that means riding into Dustridge and facing him down, so be it. Then I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. You stay here with Annie where it's safe. Safe? Lydia gestured at the doll on the table. He was just here, walked right into our house. Nowhere is safe. They stared at each other, both terrified and furious and determined. Finally, Caleb spoke. Take Annie to the Hendersons. Stay there until I come back. And if you don't come back, then Tom will make sure you get somewhere far from here, somewhere Clay can't reach you. He touched her face gently. I need to know you're safe. Please, Lydia, give me that much. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist, but she saw the resolve in his eyes and knew it was pointless. So instead she nodded, tears streaming down her face. You come back to us, she said fiercely. You hear me, Caleb Roan? You come back. I'll try. No, not try. Promise me. Promise you'll come back. He pulled her close one more time, memorizing the feel of her in his arms. I promise. They packed quickly, Lydia throwing clothes and necessities into a bag while Caleb saddled 2 horses. Annie clung to her doll, confused and frightened by the adult's urgency. Within an hour, they were ready to leave. Caleb lifted Annie onto her horse, then helped Lydia mount. The little girl looked at him with solemn eyes. You're going to fight the bad man, aren't you, Mr. Quiet? I am. Are you scared? Caleb considered the question seriously. Yes. Mama says being brave means doing scary things anyway. Your mama's right. He handed Annie her reins. You take care of her for me, all right? Keep her safe. Annie nodded, suddenly looking older than her 4 years. I will. And you come back safe. Because you're my papa now, even if you and Mama haven't said the words yet, and papas don't leave. Caleb's eyes misted. He pressed a kiss to Annie's forehead, then to Lydia's hand. I love you both, he said. Remember that. Whatever happens, remember that. Then he slapped the horse's flank and sent them galloping toward the Henderson ranch, watching until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he turn back to the house, to the threatening doll and its rope noose, and let the rage he'd been controlling finally surface. Barrett Clay wanted a fight. He'd get one. Caleb rode out at midnight, under a moonless sky that hid him like a blessing. He knew the way to Dustridge by heart, could ride it blind if needed. The darkness suited his purpose. He was done being the quiet, peaceful rancher, done turning the other cheek. Barrett had threatened his family, and that was a line no man crossed without consequences. The town was quiet when he arrived, most citizens long asleep, but lights burned in the saloon, and that's where Caleb headed. He tied his horse outside, checked his weapons one final time, and pushed through the doors. The noise died instantly. Every head turned. Men who'd been laughing seconds before fell silent, staring at the grim figure in the doorway. Caleb's eyes swept the room and found his target. Barrett Clay sat at a corner table, playing cards with 3 other men. He looked up at Caleb's entrance and smiled, the smile of a predator who's been waiting for prey to walk into his trap. Well, well, Barrett drawled, the hermit emerges, and here I thought you'd take my advice and run. Caleb walked forward, his boots loud in the silence. He stopped 6 feet from Barrett's table, his hand resting casually near his gun. You threatened my family, he said. Each word was sharp, precise. You left a doll with a noose in my house. You terrorized a 4-year-old child. Barrett spread his hands innocently. I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Caleb's eyes swept the room, addressing everyone present. Everyone in this room knows what you do, how you prey on the desperate, how you use money and threats to control people, how you burn barns and cut fences and terrorize anyone who stands up to you. Careful, Rowan. Barrett's smile had vanished. That sounds an awful lot like slander. It's truth. Caleb's voice rose, carrying to every corner of the saloon. And I'm done pretending otherwise. You're a coward, Barrett Clay. You hide behind hired guns and money. You threaten women and children. You're a bully and a cheat, and everyone here knows it. Barrett stood slowly, his face flushed with rage. You want to call me out? Is that what this is? You, alone, against me and my men? Not alone, a voice said from the doorway. Caleb turned to see Tom Henderson entering, rifle in hand. Behind him came the Millers, the Johnsons, and half a dozen other ranchers, every man who'd helped build his barn, plus several more. We heard there might be trouble, Tom said calmly, moving to stand beside Caleb. Figured we'd come make sure things stayed fair. Barrett's eyes darted from face to face, calculating odds. His hired guns shifted uncomfortably, suddenly faced with a dozen armed men instead of one. This is none of your concern, Henderson, Barrett snapped. That's where you're wrong. Tom's voice was hard. Caleb's our neighbor. That makes his concerns our concerns. And we're real interested in hearing more about these threats against women and children. Real interested indeed. The room's energy had shifted. Barrett was no longer the powerful man holding all the cards. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and for the first time in his life, genuinely afraid. You've got 3 choices, Caleb said, his voice carrying absolute authority. 1, you leave. Pack up, get out of Wyoming, and never come back. 2, I call the federal marshal, tell him about your intimidation tactics, your threats, the fire you set. Let the law handle you. Or 3, Barrett's voice shook slightly. 3, Caleb said softly. You refuse both those options and find out what happens when a man's got nothing left to lose. For a long moment, no one moved. The saloon held its breath, waiting to see which path Barrett would choose. Then slowly, the wealthy trader reached for his coat. This isn't over, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Yes, Caleb replied. It is. Barrett left with what dignity he could muster, his hired guns trailing behind. Through the saloon windows, they watched him climb into his carriage and order the driver to move. The vehicle disappeared into the night, heading south toward the railroad, toward anywhere that wasn't Dustridge. The tension broke. Men started breathing again, talking in low voices. Tom clapped Caleb on the shoulder. Reckon he won't be back, he said. Man like that, once you've humiliated him publicly, he finds easier targets elsewhere. How did you know to come? Caleb asked. Tom smiled. You're Mrs. Harrow. She showed up at our place with the little one, told Sarah what happened. Sarah sent me and every man she could round up. Said if we didn't protect you, she'd never forgive us. He paused. You've got a fierce woman there, Caleb. Don't let her go. I don't intend to. Caleb rode back to the Henderson ranch as dawn painted the sky pink and gold, his body exhausted but his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. He found Lydia waiting on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, her eyes red from crying or lack of sleep or both. When she saw him, she ran, and he dismounted just in time to catch her as she threw herself into his arms. You're alive, she sobbed. You came back. I promised, didn't I? Is it over? Is he gone? He's gone, for good. They held each other as the sun rose, as Annie emerged sleepy-eyed from the house and ran to join their embrace, as Sarah Henderson watched from the doorway with a satisfied smile. It was over. They were safe. And for the first time since that day in the Dustridge marketplace, Lydia let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a future worth fighting for. They stayed at the Henderson ranch for 2 more days, while Tom sent riders to confirm that Barrett Clay had indeed left Wyoming, his carriage spotted heading east toward the railroad station in Cheyenne. Word came back that he'd boarded a train bound for San Francisco, his hired guns scattered to the winds, his business interests in Dustridge already being picked apart by creditors he'd bullied for too long. The man who had seemed so powerful, so untouchable, had vanished like smoke once his bluff was called. Good riddance, Sarah Henderson declared, setting a plate of eggs in front of Caleb. Man like that, thinking he can terrorize decent people, should have been run out of town years ago. Lydia sat beside Caleb at the Hendersons' kitchen table, Annie in her lap, and felt the weight of fear finally beginning to lift. For weeks she'd been braced for disaster, waiting for the other shoe to drop, unable to trust that anything good could last. But watching Caleb eat breakfast in the morning sunlight, his wounds healing, his eyes peaceful, she let herself believe that maybe the worst was truly behind them. "We should go home," she said softly. Caleb looked at her, and something warm flickered in his gray eyes. "Home," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes, we should." Annie perked up immediately. "Can I ride with Mr. Quiet again?" "I think that can be arranged," Caleb said, that almost smile playing at his lips. They left after lunch, their saddlebags filled with food Sarah had insisted they take, their hearts lighter than they'd been in weeks. The ride back to the ranch felt different somehow. Not an escape or a retreat, but a homecoming. The valley opened before them like a promise, the new barn standing proud against the autumn sky, smoke rising from the chimney where Caleb had banked the fire before leaving. As they dismounted, Annie ran immediately to check on the chickens, calling out greetings to each one as if they were old friends. Lydia stood in the yard looking at the house, the barn, the garden she'd worked so hard to restore, and felt something settle in her chest. This was home. Not just shelter, not just safety, but truly home. "You all right?" Caleb asked, coming to stand beside her. "Better than all right." She turned to him. "Caleb, before Barrett, before everything that happened, you said something in the barn. Do you remember?" His ears reddened slightly. "I remember." "Did you mean it? Or was it just the moment, the fear, the—" He stopped her words with a kiss, gentle but certain, his hands cupping her face with infinite care. When he pulled back, his eyes held hers. "I meant every word," he said. "I love you, Lydia Harrow. I love Annie. I want you both to stay, not as guests, not as help, but as family. Real family. We're not married," Lydia felt compelled to point out, even as her heart soared. "People will talk." "Let them." Caleb's thumb traced her cheekbone. "But if it matters to you, if you want the words and the ceremony, I'll give you that too. Whatever you need to feel secure. Whatever makes this real in your eyes." Lydia's breath caught. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking you to build a life with me. Marriage, if you want it. Partnership, certainly. Love, absolutely." He paused, struggling with words as he always did. "I'm asking you to stay forever, not just until something better comes along. I'm asking you to be mine, and let me be yours, and raise Annie together, and maybe—" He stopped, looking almost embarrassed. "Maybe what?" "Maybe have more children someday. If you wanted, brothers or sisters for Annie, a house full of noise and chaos instead of silence." He searched her face anxiously. "Is that too much? Am I assuming too much?" Lydia laughed through sudden tears. "It's not too much. It's everything. It's perfect." She rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring all her hope and joy and yes into it. When she pulled back, she was smiling. Yes, Caleb. Yes to all of it. Marriage and partnership and family and noise and chaos and everything. His smile transformed his entire face, making him look younger, lighter, almost boyish. He picked her up and spun her around, and she laughed, really laughed, deep and free, the way she hadn't since before Samuel died. Annie came running at the sound, demanding to know what was so funny, and Caleb scooped her up too, holding both his girls close. "We're getting married," Lydia told her daughter. "Mr. Quiet is going to be your papa for real." Annie's eyes went wide. "Really? Really and truly?" "Really and truly," Caleb confirmed. Annie threw her arms around his neck with such enthusiasm she nearly knocked his hat off. "I knew it! I told Mama you'd be a good papa. Can I be in the wedding? Can I wear a pretty dress? Can we have cake?" "Yes to all of it," Caleb said, his voice suspiciously thick. That night, after Annie was asleep, Caleb and Lydia sat by the fire, as had become their habit. But tonight felt different, charged with possibility and promise. Caleb pulled something from his pocket, a small object wrapped in cloth. "I want to show you something," he said quietly. "Something I haven't shown anyone since they died." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a simple gold ring, worn smooth with age. Lydia recognized it immediately as a wedding band. "Sarah's?" she asked gently. Caleb nodded. "Thought I'd never take it out again. Thought I'd keep it forever as a reminder of what I lost." He turned the ring over in his fingers.
But holding on to the past doesn't honor it. Living again, loving again, that honors it. Sarah would want me to be happy, would want Emma's room to have another child's laughter in it.
You don't have to explain, Lydia said. I want to. He looked at her directly. I love Sarah, loved her with everything I had. And when she died, I thought that was it, that I'd used up my portion of love for this lifetime. But then you came along, and Annie and I learned something. Love isn't finite. Having loved before doesn't mean you can't love again. The heart's bigger than we think. He set Sarah's ring aside carefully, then reached into his other pocket and pulled out a different ring. This one newer, simpler, clearly purchased recently. Got this in Dustridge, he admitted, before everything with Barrett. Kept carrying it around, trying to find the courage to ask. He held it out to her. It's not fancy. I'm not a wealthy man, but it's real gold, and it's a promise. Will you wear it? Lydia's hands trembled as she held out her left hand. Caleb slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been made for her. She stared at it, this simple circle of gold that meant everything, that transformed her from widow to bride, from homeless to beloved. When? She asked. When should we marry? Whenever you want. Tomorrow, if you'd like. Or spring, if you want time to prepare. Lydia thought about it, about fancy weddings and long engagements and all the traditional trappings. Then she thought about how precarious life was, how quickly everything could change, how Barrett's threats had reminded her that tomorrow was never guaranteed. Soon, she decided, not tomorrow. Annie deserves time to be excited about it, to have her pretty dress. But soon, before winter sets in, before anything else can go wrong. Nothing's going to go wrong, Caleb said with quiet certainty. We've had our trials, paid our dues. Now we get to have our happiness. They set the date for 3 weeks away, enough time to make preparations, but not so long that the waiting would drive them mad. Sarah Henderson took charge of the arrangements with the enthusiasm of a general planning a campaign, declaring that even a small wedding needed proper organization. You'll marry at the ranch, she announced, brooking no argument, under that big cottonwood by the creek. It's beautiful this time of year, and it's your land, your home. That's where you should start your new life together. Lydia let herself be swept up in the preparations, grateful for Sarah's friendship and expertise. Together they sewed a dress for Annie, pale blue cotton with white trim, simple but lovely. For herself, Lydia chose one of Sarah's dresses from the trunk, a soft cream-colored gown that Sarah had worn for her own wedding 30 years prior. Something borrowed, something blue, Sarah said, pinning the hem. That's 2 of the traditions right there. I don't have anything old or new, Lydia pointed out. The ring's new. And as for old, Sarah disappeared into her bedroom and returned with a delicate lace handkerchief. This belonged to my grandmother. It survived 3 weddings in my family, and I'd be honored if it survived a 4th. Lydia took the handkerchief with reverent hands, overwhelmed by the generosity of these people who had welcomed her so completely. Sarah, you've done so much. Hush now. That's what neighbors do. That's what friends do. Sarah squeezed her hand. Besides, seeing Caleb happy again, that's payment enough. That man was withering away out here alone. You've brought him back to life. The weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Caleb threw himself into making the ranch perfect, repairing anything that needed fixing, painting the porch, building new furniture for the bedroom that would soon be theirs to share. Annie helped everyone with equal enthusiasm, her excitement infectious. Only 5 more days, she'd announce each morning as if they might have forgotten. Only 4 more days. Only 3 more days. The night before the wedding, Lydia couldn't sleep. She stood at the window of the bedroom she'd been using, looking out at the moonlit valley, and felt the weight of the moment. Tomorrow she would marry Caleb Rowan. Tomorrow she would become someone's wife again, would take on all the vulnerability and risk that came with loving someone that much. A soft knock at her door made her turn. Come in. Caleb entered, looking uncertain. Saw your light on. Thought you might be worrying. I'm terrified, she admitted. He moved to stand beside her at the window. Of marrying me? Of losing you. The words burst out. Caleb, what if something happens? What if we get this happiness and then it's taken away? I lost Samuel. You lost Sarah and Emma. We both know how quickly everything can fall apart.
We do, he agreed. And that's exactly why we should grab this happiness while we can. Life's uncertain, Lydia.
Always has been, always will be. But hiding from love because you're afraid of loss, that's not living. That's just a slower kind of dying. She leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. When did you get so wise? I'm not wise. I'm just a man who wasted 4 years being afraid. Don't want to waste any more. They stood together in the moonlight, not speaking, just being. After a while, Caleb pressed a kiss to her temple and turned to leave, respecting the tradition that they shouldn't see each other before the ceremony. Caleb? She called softly. He paused at the door. I love you. Whatever happens, whatever tomorrow brings, I love you. I love you too, he smiled. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow's a big day. Tomorrow came with perfect weather, crisp autumn air, brilliant sunshine, leaves turning golden red on the cottonwood tree. Neighbors began arriving at noon, wagons full of families dressed in their Sunday best, bringing food and gifts and good wishes. Someone had strung bunting from the barn. Someone else had scattered wildflowers along the path to the creek. Lydia dressed in the borrowed cream gown, her hands shaking so badly that Sarah had to help with the buttons. Annie danced around in her new blue dress, a crown of fall flowers in her hair, chattering excitedly about everything and nothing. You look like a princess, Mama, she declared. You look like one too, sweetheart. Sarah stepped back to survey her handiwork. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Caleb's going to forget how to breathe when he sees you. They walked down to the creek together, Sarah on one side, Annie on the other, holding Lydia's hands. The gathered neighbors formed a semicircle under the cottonwood tree, and there at the center stood Caleb, wearing what Lydia suspected was his only suit, a simple dark jacket and pants that made him look formal and uncomfortable and heartbreakingly handsome all at once. Tom Henderson stood beside him as witness, and when Caleb saw Lydia approaching, his expression transformed. Sarah was right. He looked like someone had stolen his breath, his eyes wide and soft and full of wonder. The minister from Dustridge, a kind man named Reverend Matthews, who had thankfully not been in Barrett Clay's pocket, smiled at them both. Dearly beloved, he began, and Lydia felt tears already threatening. She'd been through this once before, with Samuel, but this felt different. Then she'd been young and naive, believing love conquered all. Now she was older, scarred by loss and hardship, and she knew better. Love didn't conquer all, but it was still worth fighting for. The ceremony was simple, traditional. They spoke their vows, to love, to honor, to cherish, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, till death parted them. When Caleb slipped the ring onto her finger, the same ring she'd already been wearing for weeks, his hand was steady, his voice clear. With this ring I thee wed. Lydia's voice shook when she repeated the words, sliding a ring onto his finger that Sarah had helped her buy in town. With this ring I thee wed. You may kiss your bride, Reverend Matthews said, smiling. Caleb cupped Lydia's face in his hands and kissed her gently, reverently, as if she were something precious and breakable. The gathered neighbors cheered, Annie squealed with delight, and Lydia felt something click into place, some piece of herself that had been missing settling finally into home. The celebration lasted well into the evening. Tables groaned under the weight of food. Roasted meats and fresh bread, pies and cakes, preserves and pickles, and every good thing the community could provide. Someone produced a fiddle and began playing, and soon couples were dancing in the grass, laughing and spinning under the autumn sky. Caleb, who claimed he couldn't dance, held Lydia close and swayed gently to the music, paying no attention to rhythm or steps, just moving with her in his arms. Happy? He murmured against her ear. Deliriously. Good. He pulled back to look at her. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way. That's a tall order. I'm up for the challenge. Annie danced with the Henderson children, her laughter ringing out clear and joyful. Watching her, Lydia felt her throat tighten with emotion. This was what she'd fought for through 3 years of poverty and desperation. This moment right here, her daughter safe and happy and loved, surrounded by community, with a future full of possibility instead of fear. As the sun set and the stars emerged, neighbors began packing up to leave, offering final congratulations and blessings. Tom Henderson shook Caleb's hand firmly. "You done good, son," he said. "Real good. Couldn't have done it without all of you. That's what community's for. Remember that when someone else needs help down the line." "I will." Finally, it was just the three of them, Caleb, Lydia, and Annie, standing in the yard of their ranch, their home, watching the last wagon disappear over the ridge. "I'm sleepy," Annie announced, yawning hugely. "Bed for you, little one," Lydia said, starting to lead her inside. Can Papa tuck me in?" Annie looked up at Caleb hopefully. "Now that you're really my Papa, you should do Papa things." Caleb's eyes misted. "I'd like that very much." They went inside together, and Lydia watched from the doorway as Caleb tucked Annie into bed with gentle hands, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "Papa?" Annie said sleepily. "Yes?" "I'm glad you saved us. I'm glad we came here. I'm glad you're not quiet anymore." "I'm still pretty quiet." "But you talk to us. That's what matters." She yawned again. "Will you tell me about Emma?" The question hung in the air. Lydia tensed, ready to intervene, but Caleb surprised her. "She was about your age," he said softly. "Had dark hair like mine, but her mother's smile. She loved horses, used to follow me everywhere, asking a million questions, just like you do." "Do you miss her?" "Every day. But having you here, it helps. It doesn't replace her. Nothing could. But it helps heal the hurt." "Good." Annie's eyes were drifting closed. "Because I need a papa, and you need someone to ask you a million questions. So we're perfect together." "We are," Caleb agreed, his voice rough. "We're perfect together." He stayed until she was fully asleep, then rose and found Lydia waiting. She took his hand and led him outside onto the porch where they'd spent so many evenings learning each other. "That was beautiful," she said. "What you said to her about Emma. It's true. You and Annie, you haven't erased the past, but you've given me a future. That's everything." They stood together in the darkness, his arm around her shoulders, her head against his chest. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of autumn and wood smoke and home. "I was thinking," Lydia said carefully, "about what you said, about maybe having more children." Caleb's arm tightened around her. And I think I'd like that. Not right away. We should have time to just be us first. But someday. A brother or sister for Annie. More noise and chaos." She smiled. "More love." "More love," Caleb repeated, as if testing how the words felt. Then he turned her to face him, his hands on her waist. "I spent 4 years believing I'd used up all my capacity for love, that there was nothing left in me worth giving. You proved me wrong, Lydia Roan." Lydia Roan. Her new name, still strange on her tongue but growing more familiar by the moment. She liked it, liked the way it tied her to this man, this place, this life they were building together. "We proved each other wrong," she corrected. "I thought I was broken, thought poverty and loss had hollowed me out until there was nothing left but survival instinct. But you showed me I could still hope, still trust, still love." He kissed her then, deeper than before, with passion but also tenderness, promise, and desire intertwined. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I want to show you something," he said. He led her around the side of the house, to a spot she hadn't noticed before. A small cleared area where 2 wooden crosses stood, simple but carefully made. Sarah and Emma, the dates carved into the wood. "I visit them sometimes," Caleb said quietly. "Talk to them. Tell them about my day, about the ranch." He paused. "I told them about you, about Annie, about how you came into my life and changed everything." Lydia felt tears slide down her cheeks. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I was sorry for taking so long to live again, for spending 4 years just existing instead of honoring their memory by finding joy." His hand found hers. "And I told them thank you, because loving them taught me how to love, made it possible for me to recognize what I was feeling when you came along." "Do you think they'd approve? Of me? Of us?" "I know they would. Caleb's voice was certain. Sarah always said life was for the living, that grief was necessary, but dwelling in it was wasteful. She'd be glad I found you, glad Annie will grow up with love and laughter instead of silence and sorrow. They stood there for a long moment, honoring the past while embracing the future. Then Caleb led her back to the house, to the bedroom that was now truly theirs, where they could begin their life together in earnest. The days that followed settled into new rhythms. Caleb was still quiet by nature, but he spoke more now, sharing his thoughts and feelings instead of hoarding them. Lydia continued managing the house and garden, but with joy instead of desperation, knowing her work was building something permanent. And Annie thrived, growing rounder and taller, her laughter a constant soundtrack to their days. Winter came early that year, blanketing the valley in snow by mid-November. But the new barn stood strong, the animals were sheltered and fed, and the house stayed warm with fires burning and love filling every corner. They spent long evenings by the hearth, Caleb teaching Annie her letters, while Lydia mended or sewed or simply sat and watched her family with quiet contentment. One night, as snow fell softly outside and Annie slept peacefully in her room, Caleb pulled Lydia close on the sofa. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Staying here instead of trying to make a life somewhere else? Somewhere with more people, more opportunities?" Lydia looked around the simple room, at the handmade furniture, the mended curtains, the worn but clean floors, looked at the man beside her with his scarred hands and quiet strength, thought about her daughter sleeping safely down the hall, about the neighbors who'd become family, about the life they were building day by day. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. Even when it's hard, when the work is endless and the money's tight and—" She silenced him with a kiss. "Especially then. Because we're facing it together. Because hard work with a purpose is better than easy living without meaning. Because this—" She gestured around them. "This is everything I ever wanted and didn't know to hope for." He smiled, that full, genuine smile he gave only to her and Annie. "I love you, Lydia Rowan. I love you too, Caleb Rowan. Now and always." Spring came eventually, as it always does, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the frozen earth. Lydia planted her garden with Sarah's help, Annie helping by digging holes wherever she pleased and chattering about how big the vegetables would grow. Caleb prepared for calving season, his hands fully healed now, his body strong again. And on a warm April morning, Lydia woke feeling different. She lay in bed, Caleb still sleeping beside her, and placed a hand on her stomach. It was too early to be certain, but she knew. Somehow, she knew. She waited until evening to tell him, until after dinner when Annie was playing outside and they had a moment of relative privacy. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "I think we're going to need to make another bed," she said softly. Caleb's eyes widened. "You mean, I'm not certain yet, but I think so." His face transformed with joy and wonder. He dropped to his knees and pressed his ear to her stomach, as if he might hear something, anything, that would confirm this miracle. "When?" he asked. "Late autumn, maybe. November or December." He looked up at her, tears on his face, all his usual stoicism abandoned. "A baby. Our baby. Our baby," she confirmed, crying too now. "Annie's going to be a big sister." They held each other, laughing and crying at once, overwhelmed by the perfection of this moment. After so much loss, so much hardship, life was giving them this, new life, new hope, new love to add to what they'd already built. When they told Annie, she shrieked with excitement and immediately began planning everything the baby would need, where it would sleep, what they would name it, whether it would be a brother or sister. "Can we name it Emma if it's a girl?" she asked Caleb solemnly. "Because Emma was your first daughter, and this could be like having her back a little bit." Caleb picked her up, holding her close. "That's a beautiful thought, Annie, and I think that would honor Emma's memory perfectly." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, Lydia blooming with health despite the hard work of ranch life. Sarah Henderson declared her disgustingly radiant and made sure she rested enough, sometimes forcibly sitting her down when she tried to do too much. "You're growing a human being," Sarah would scold. "That's work enough. Let Caleb handle the heavy chores." Caleb needed no convincing.
He hovered over Lydia with anxious devotion, barely letting her lift anything heavier than a spoon.
She found it endearing and exasperating in equal measure. "I'm pregnant, not fragile," she protested one afternoon when he insisted on carrying a basket of laundry for her. "You're precious," he corrected. "There's a difference." November came with the first snow, and on a cold night with wind howling outside, Lydia's labor began. Sarah came immediately, along with the doctor from Dustridge, the same one who'd been too expensive when Annie was sick, but who came without question now that Lydia was part of the community. Caleb paced outside the bedroom door, Annie holding his hand, both of them tense with worry. Labor was dangerous. Both of them had lost people they loved to childbirth's complications. The hours stretched endlessly, marked by Lydia's cries and Sarah's calm voice giving instructions. Finally, just as dawn was breaking, a new sound joined the wind, the thin, furious wail of a newborn baby. The bedroom door opened. Sarah emerged smiling, her sleeves rolled up. "You have a son," she announced, "healthy, loud, and already demanding attention, just like his papa." Caleb's knees almost gave out. "Lydia?" "Tired but well. She wants to see you." He entered the bedroom with Annie clinging to his hand. Lydia lay in the bed, exhausted and radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up when they entered,
her smile tired but transcendent. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Caleb approached like a man walking on sacred ground. He looked down at the baby, red-faced and wrinkled and beautiful, and felt his heart expand in ways he hadn't known were possible. This was his son, his and Lydia's. Living proof that life continued, that love endured, that second chances were real. "He's perfect," Caleb whispered, touching one tiny fist with a gentle finger. "He is," Lydia agreed. "Annie, come see your brother." Annie climbed carefully onto the bed, her eyes huge. "He's so small." "Was I that small?" "Even smaller," Lydia said. "Lydia."
"But you grew, and so will he." "What should we name him?" Annie asked. Caleb and Lydia exchanged glances. They'd discussed this, made their decision weeks ago, but saying it aloud felt momentous. "Samuel," Lydia said, "after my first husband, who gave me Annie and taught me what love was." "And Thomas," Caleb added, "after Tom Henderson, who helped us when we needed it most." "Samuel Thomas Roan," Annie tried out the name. "That's a big name for such a little person." "He'll grow into it," Caleb said, unable to take his eyes off his son. They sat together on the bed, Caleb, Lydia, Annie, and the newest member of their family, as the sun rose over the Wyoming Valley, painting everything gold. Outside, the ranch waited for them, work to be done, and animals to tend, and a life to live. But for this moment, they simply were. Simply existed in this perfect bubble of love and safety and family. The years that followed were good ones. Hard, certainly. Ranch life was never easy, but good. Samuel grew from a squalling infant into a sturdy toddler who followed his father everywhere, mimicking Caleb's walk, his gestures, his quiet way of moving through the world. Annie blossomed into a capable young girl who helped with her brother and the ranch work both, her early childhood trauma fading into memory as present happiness displaced past pain. 2 years after Samuel's birth, another child arrived, a daughter they named Emma Rose, honoring both Caleb's lost daughter and the beauty that could bloom even in harsh soil. And 2 years after that, another son, who they named Daniel, simply because they liked how it sounded when called across the prairie. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Caleb's herd grew. Lydia's garden produced abundantly. They added rooms to the house as the family expanded, built a second barn, dug a deeper well. What had been one lonely man's subsistence became a thriving family ranch. Annie grew into a young woman, strong and capable, who could rope a calf as well as any of the ranch hands Caleb eventually had to hire as the operation grew. She'd inherited her mother's fierce loyalty and her father's quiet strength, blended into something uniquely her own. "I'm never leaving," she declared one evening when she was 15, watching her younger siblings play in the yard. "This is home. These are my people. Why would I go anywhere else?" Lydia, gray beginning to thread through her hair but her eyes still bright, smiled at her daughter. "You say that now, but you might feel differently when you're older, When some young man comes calling, then he'll have to move here,
Annie said firmly. Because I meant what I said. I'm never leaving. And she didn't. When she married at 19, it was to a rancher's son from the next valley, and they built their house on Roan land, becoming part of the family operation.
When Samuel was old enough, he joined his father working the cattle. Emma Rose took after her mother, managing the household and garden with efficient grace. And Daniel, the baby, surprised everyone by being the one with a head for figures, managing the ranch's books and accounts. On a warm summer evening, 30 years after that day in the Dustridge marketplace, when Lydia's life had almost ended, she sat on the porch with Caleb and watched the sun set over their valley. Grandchildren played in the yard. Annie's children, grown now and returned with children of their own. The sound of laughter and life filled the air. "Do you remember," Lydia said softly, "that first night I stayed here? When you slept in the barn because you didn't want me to be uncomfortable?" Caleb, his hair fully gray now, but his eyes still that same stormy color, smiled. "I remember. I also remember you threatening to shoot Barrett Clay despite never having fired a gun before. But I remember you wearing Annie's flower crown through dinner. I remember falling in love with you while watching you tend the garden, not even knowing yet that's what was happening." Lydia reached for his hand, found it immediately, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. "We've had a good life, haven't we?" "The best life," Caleb said. "Better than I ever thought possible." "Do you still talk to them?" Lydia asked gently. "To Sarah and Emma?" "Sometimes. Not as much as I used to." He looked at her. "I tell them they were right, that life goes on, that love doesn't end, it just transforms, that I kept their memory alive by living fully instead of dying slowly." One of the grandchildren, Sarah's boy, named Caleb after his grandfather, ran up to the porch. "Grandpa, Daddy says there's a mare about to foal. Can we go watch?" Caleb stood with a slight groan. His knees weren't what they used to be, and offered his hand to the boy. "Let's go see." Lydia watched them walk toward the barn, the old man and the young boy, and felt her heart swell with gratitude. Life had given her everything: love, family, purpose, home. She'd gone from a widow on her knees in the dirt, begging a cruel man not to take her child, to this, matriarch of a thriving family, grandmother to a new generation, partner to a man who'd shown her that silence could speak volumes and that love could bloom even in the harshest soil. That night, after the children had gone home and the house was quiet, Caleb found something while sorting through old papers. He held it up, showing Lydia, a faded red ribbon, carefully preserved. "What's that?" she asked. "The ribbon Annie was wearing the first day I saw you," he said. "I kept it, carried it in my pocket for weeks, not even knowing why, just knowing it was important." Lydia took the ribbon, feeling its fragile age, and understood. This small scrap of fabric had been the beginning, the moment when Caleb's heart, frozen for so long, began to thaw. The moment when their paths, so different, had started converging toward this life they'd built together. "Keep it," she said, handing it back, "as a reminder of where we started." "Don't need reminding," Caleb said, pulling her close. "I remember every moment, every choice that led us here, every fear we conquered, every joy we found." "No regrets?" Lydia asked, though she knew the answer. "Only one," Caleb said, his eyes twinkling. "I should have spoken up sooner. Should have told you I loved you weeks before I finally managed to say the words." "You showed me every day," Lydia corrected. "Through every kindness, every protection, every moment you chose us over your own comfort. I knew long before you said it." They stood together in the lamplight, two people who'd survived loss and found each other, who'd built something beautiful from shared trauma and stubborn hope. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the grass the way it always had, the way it always would. But inside in the house they'd filled with love and children and life, two hearts beat in rhythm, still finding joy in each other after all these years. This was the promise they'd made each other that day under the cottonwood tree, and every day since, to choose love over fear, presence over absence, building over breaking, to create a home not just of timber and stone, but of shared moments and gentle touches and words spoken and unspoken. They'd kept that promise. And in keeping it, They discovered something most people spend their whole lives seeking, that home isn't a place, it's the people you love and who love you back. That family isn't just blood, it's choosing each other every day, over and over again. That happiness isn't the absence of hardship, but the presence of love strong enough to weather any storm. As they climbed into bed that night, Caleb pulled Lydia close, her head resting on his shoulder the way it had for 30 years. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "For what?" "For being brave enough to stay, for choosing me, for building this life with me." "Thank you for stepping forward," Lydia replied, "for being the one person in that marketplace who couldn't walk away, for saving us." "We saved each other," Caleb corrected. "That's what love does." And there, in the darkness, in the house full of sleeping family, in the valley they'd made home, two people who'd been saved by each other's courage drifted into sleep, wrapped in each other's arms, content in the knowledge that they'd found what everyone seeks, but few ever find: a love that endures, a home that shelters, and a life well lived. The end.